My name is Claire. I am 29 years old. On a freezing Christmas Eve, my father left me entirely alone to care for my 82-year-old grandfather, calling it a simple favor so he could go on a luxury ski trip. But at midnight, my grandfather stood up from his wheelchair, locked my apartment door, and whispered that my father had forged a deed to his house. What I discovered in the dark hours of that Christmas morning shattered everything I ever believed about my family and set off a chain of events that ended with handcuffs at a high society New Year celebration. It started at exactly 6:00 in the evening. Outside my cramped Boston apartment, the snow was falling so heavily it looked like a solid white wall against the street lamps. I was in the middle of closing out year-end tax files for my freelance bookkeeping clients. My desk was the kitchen table. My dinner was a lukewarm bowl of soup. Then came the pounding on my door. It was not a festive holiday knock, but a loud, impatient hammering that made the cheap wood rattle in its frame. I pulled open the door and the freezing wind rushed in along with the 4 people who made up the family I had spent my life trying to please. My father, Richard, pushed his way inside first. He was shoving a heavy medical wheelchair over the threshold. Sitting in that chair, bundled in a heavy wool coat and looking exhausted, was my grandfather, Walter. Right behind my father came my mother, Diane, brushing snow off her designer boots with a look of pure disgust. Then came my younger sister, Brittany, wrapped in a pristine mink coat, holding onto the arm of her fiancé, Chad. Chad was a junior partner at a corporate law firm, and he wore a tailored cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than my rent for the entire year. The tiny entryway of my apartment was instantly suffocated by their presence. My father did not say hello. He did not say Merry Christmas. He simply hoisted a large plastic bag filled with adult diapers, prescription bottles, and medical wipes, and dropped it heavily onto my faded sofa. The bag hit the cushions with a dull thud. "We are heading out to Aspen," my father declared, his voice echoing too loudly in my small living room. Chad's parents rented a private chalet for the week to celebrate the engagement. "We are taking the late flight out of Logan Airport right now." I stared at him, trying to process what was happening. Aspen, a private chalet. Meanwhile, I was struggling to pay my heating bill. I looked down at Walter, who sat quietly, his hands resting on his lap. "But what about Grandpa?" I asked. "We had a family dinner planned for tomorrow." My mother let out a sharp, impatient sigh. "Oh, Claire, do not be difficult tonight. We simply cannot take an 82-year-old man in a wheelchair on a luxury ski trip. Chad's family is very high society, and we need to make the right impression. We cannot be burdened with arranging medical transport and scheduling medications when we are supposed to be celebrating your sister." Brittany wrinkled her nose and pinched the collar of her mink coat tightly around her neck. "God, it smells like cheap cooking oil and bleach in here, Claire. Do you ever open a window? I am going to have to dry clean this coat before we even get to the airport." Chad checked his heavy gold watch and smirked. "Let us make it quick, babe. The black car is waiting downstairs with the engine running. We do not want to hit airport traffic." My father turned back to me, pointing a stiff finger at my chest. "You are going to watch your grandfather. It is a simple favor, Claire. You are just doing bookkeeping from home anyway, so it is not like you have a real schedule to maintain. You can type numbers into a computer while he watches television." I felt my face burn with a familiar shame. I worked 14 hours a day managing ledgers and balancing accounts just to keep my head above water. I had put myself through college without a single dollar from my parents, taking on massive student debt because my father told me I was not worth the investment. Yet he was perfectly willing to fund Brittany's lavish lifestyle and now her extravagant wedding. "Dad, you cannot just drop him here without any warning," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I do not have a ground-floor apartment. The bathroom is not equipped for a wheelchair. I do not even have groceries stocked for a special diet." My father stepped closer, his physical presence completely overtaking my narrow kitchen space. "I am not asking for a debate, Claire. I am telling you what is going to happen. You live alone. You have no husband, no children, and no social life. The least you can do is help your family when we ask. Feed him. Give him his pills. We will be back on January 2nd. Do not call us unless somebody is dying. I want to enjoy this vacation." Before I could utter another word of protest, my mother was already ushering Brittany and Chad back out into the freezing hallway. She did not even look at her own father-in-law sitting in the wheelchair. She just pulled her scarf up and complained about the snow ruining her hair. My father turned toward the door. "Oh, and Claire, do not forget to turn the heat up. He is old and gets cold easily. Try to be a good granddaughter for once." With that, the heavy wooden door shut. The deadbolt rattled. I heard their footsteps hurrying down the hallway, rushing toward their warm, waiting luxury car, rushing toward their expensive vacation. The silence they left behind was deafening. The only sound in the apartment was the howling wind outside the frosted windows and the ticking of my wall clock. I stood frozen in the center of the room. I looked over at the plastic bag of medical supplies dumped carelessly on my sofa. Then I looked down at my grandfather. He was staring straight ahead, his face unreadable. I had always loved Grandpa Walter. He was a retired history teacher who used to read to me when I was a little girl. But over the last year, my father had insisted that Walter was rapidly declining. My father claimed Walter was suffering from severe dementia, losing his mobility and completely dependent on his care. My father had moved Walter into his house supposedly to protect him. I was rarely allowed to visit. My father always said Walter was too confused and easily agitated by guests. "Grandpa," I said softly, crouching down so I was eye level with him. "I am so sorry they did this. Let us get you out of that heavy coat. The apartment will warm up soon." I helped him unbutton his thick wool coat. His hands felt cold. I hung the coat over a kitchen chair and turned to the bag of supplies my father had abandoned. Inside, there were various pill bottles, a blood pressure cuff, and a few changes of clothes. I started organizing the medications on the kitchen counter, trying to make sense of the dosage instructions my father had hastily scrawled on a torn piece of paper. As I was reading the sloppy handwriting, I realized something was missing. "Grandpa, where is your cell phone?" I asked, looking back at him. "I want to save my number on speed dial just in case you need me while I am in the other room." Walter did not answer immediately. He slowly patted the pockets of his slacks and then the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. He frowned. "Richard took it," he said. His voice was raspy but surprisingly clear. "I stopped sorting the pill bottles. He took it." "Why would he take your phone?" "He told me I would not need it," Walter replied, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. "He said I would just get confused and call the wrong people. He took it right before we left the house." A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It was one thing to dump an 82-year-old man on my doorstep without warning. It was entirely another thing to intentionally strip him of his only means of communication. Without his phone, Walter could not call his friends from his old neighborhood. He could not call his doctors. He could not access his bank accounts. He was completely, utterly isolated in my apartment. I walked over to the window and looked out into the snowy night. The taillights of the Blacktown car had long since vanished down the street. We were snowed in. My father had engineered this perfectly. He had dumped Walter in a place where no one would come looking for him and removed his ability to reach the outside world. Dad just wanted to make sure we were completely disconnected for the holiday, I reasoned, trying to convince myself more than my grandfather. He is probably just being overprotective. Walter looked up at me. His brown eyes, usually cloudy with what my father called dementia, suddenly looked incredibly sharp and focused. "Richard is not overprotective, Claire. He is precise. He never does anything without a reason." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. There was no confusion in his voice. There was no dementia in his gaze. He sounded exactly like the man who used to teach history to high school seniors, the man who demanded facts and evidence. I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling. "Well, let us just get you settled in the bedroom, Grandpa. You can sleep in my bed tonight. I will take the sofa. It is perfectly fine." I wheeled him into my small bedroom and helped him transfer to the edge of the bed. He moved slowly, deliberately, but with more strength than I expected. I unpacked a few of his things and set a glass of water on the nightstand. I told him to rest and that I would be right outside if he needed anything at all. I closed the bedroom door, leaving it open just a crack so I could hear him. I walked back into the living room and sat down on the faded sofa, running my hands over my face. The holiday was ruined. I was going to spend Christmas answering client emails and trying to figure out how to bathe an elderly man in a bathroom that barely fit one person. I felt a wave of resentment wash over me. I resented my sister for her perfect life. I resented my mother for her constant disdain. And I resented my father for treating me like a convenience store he could walk into whenever he needed something cheap and fast. But as the hours ticked by and the snow piled higher against the window panes, that resentment slowly morphed into a deep, creeping dread. I kept thinking about the missing cell phone. Why would my father take the phone of an elderly man with medical needs? It made absolutely no sense. If I had an emergency with Walter, my father was on a plane to Colorado. I would have to rely entirely on my own phone and emergency services. It was as if my father wanted Walter to disappear from the grid entirely. I pulled out my own phone and dialed my father's number just to see if he would answer. It went straight to voicemail. I tried my mother's number. Voicemail. I tried Brittany. Voicemail. They had completely shut me out just as they always did. I tossed my phone onto the kitchen table and tried to focus on the tax ledgers glowing on my laptop screen. But the numbers blurred together. My mind kept looping back to the plastic bag of pills, the missing phone, and the strange, sharp look in my grandfather's eyes. The apartment was dead silent. The wind outside had died down to a low whistle. It was approaching midnight. Christmas was officially here. I leaned my head back against the sofa cushions and closed my eyes, wishing for the morning to come so I could think clearly. And then I heard a sound that made my eyes snap open. It was the sound of a door clicking shut. I sat up quickly, looking toward the hallway. My bedroom door, which I had left slightly ajar, was now completely closed. I heard the distinct metallic click of the lock turning from the inside. "Grandpa!" I called out, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I stood up and walked quickly down the short hallway. "Grandpa, are you okay in there? Why did you lock the door?" There was no answer. I knocked gently on the wood. "Grandpa, please open the door. You're going to make me panic." I heard movement inside. It was not the shuffling sound of a frail man dragging his feet. It was the sound of someone walking with purpose. The lock clicked again, and the door opened a few inches. My grandfather stood there in the dim light. He was not using his wheelchair. He was not leaning on the doorframe for support. He stood perfectly straight and pulled me quickly into the bedroom, shutting the door firmly behind us and locking it once more. I opened my mouth to speak, but he raised a finger to his lips, silencing me. He walked over to the window and pulled the cheap blinds tightly shut, ensuring no one from the street below could look up into the room. "Grandpa?" "What is going on?" I whispered, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline. "Why are you walking around like this? Dad said you could not even stand up on your own." Walter turned to face me. He reached his hand into the lining of his trousers where a small secret pocket had been sewn into the waistband. He pulled out a thick plastic-wrapped folder folded tightly in half. "Your father says a lot of things, Claire," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "He tells people I am losing my mind. He tells people I cannot walk. He tells people I need him to manage everything. He does it so nobody questions what he is doing behind closed doors." He pressed the plastic-wrapped folder into my trembling hands. The plastic was warm from being pressed against his body. They did not go to Aspen just to celebrate a wedding, Walter said, his eyes locking onto mine with terrifying intensity. "Richard is hiding from his creditors, and he is stealing my house." I stared down at the folder in my hands. The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. I slowly peeled back the plastic wrapping. Inside there were 2 documents. The first was a bank statement from a major national bank. The second was a property deed, a certificate of title for the beautiful colonial estate Walter had lived in for 40 years, the home he and my late grandmother had worked their entire lives to pay off. "Look at the bottom of the second page," Walter instructed, pointing a weathered finger at the document. I turned to the second page of the deed. It showed a legal transfer of ownership. According to the paper, the property had been transferred from Walter into a newly formed limited liability company. I recognized the name of the LLC immediately. It was the exact same name my father used for his so-called consulting business. But that was not the part that made my blood run cold. As a bookkeeper, I spent my life looking at signatures, verifying documents, and catching discrepancies. I looked at the signature on the transfer line. It spelled out Walter's full legal name. But the slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen, the way the letters connected it was entirely wrong. It was a clumsy imitation. I looked up at my grandfather, my breathing shallow. "Grandpa," I whispered, "this is a forgery. You did not sign this." "No, I did not," he replied, his voice hardening with quiet fury. "Richard forged my signature. He moved my house into his shell company, and he used it as collateral to take out a massive predatory loan. That is how he is paying for Brittany's wedding. That is how he bought Chad that new Porsche. And the loan is defaulting in exactly 8 days. If he does not sell my house to a cash buyer before then, the bank is going to foreclose, and I will be left with absolutely nothing." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The missing cell phone, the abrupt dumping of Walter at my apartment, the isolation. It was all a calculated move. My father had not just abandoned his father on Christmas Eve. He had kidnapped him, removing him from the board so he could finalize the sale of stolen property without Walter ever knowing until it was too late. The Christmas Eve silence of my apartment was completely broken by the deafening roar of the truth. I was holding the evidence of a massive federal crime committed by my own father, and I suddenly knew that our lives were never going to be the same again. The cheap digital clock above my stove shifted to midnight. Christmas had officially arrived, but my cramped apartment felt entirely devoid of holiday spirit. The blizzard outside had escalated into a complete whiteout, throwing heavy sheets of snow against my single-pane windows. I stood at the kitchen sink washing the bowl from my meager dinner. The warm water running over my hands was the only comforting sensation in the entire room. My mind was racing with the sheer audacity of what my family had just done. My father had literally abandoned an 82-year-old man on a holiday just so he could rub elbows with my sister, a wealthy future-in-laws. It was cruel even by Richard's standard. I turned off the faucet and grabbed a dish towel, drying my hands as I walked back toward the living room. I needed to check on my grandfather. My father had painted such a bleak picture of Walter, a declining health, claiming his dementia was so advanced he barely knew what year it was. I fully expected to find him slumped in the bed, staring blankly at the wall. Instead, the moment I stepped out of the kitchen, my heart leaped into my throat. Walter was not in the bed. He was not in the wheelchair. He was standing right in the middle of my small living room, and he was not wobbling. He was not hunched over, clutching the furniture for support. My grandfather stood tall, his posture straight, his shoulders squared. He looked exactly like the commanding high school history teacher I remembered from my childhood. Before I could even process the shock of seeing him on his feet, Walter walked purposefully past me. He moved with a quiet, steady grace that absolutely defied the frail narrative my father had been selling to everyone. He went straight to the front door of my apartment. He engaged the deadbolt, locking it with a firm metallic click. Then he reached up and fastened the security chain. I stood frozen, clutching the dish towel. "Grandpa," I breathed out the word barely louder than a whisper. "What are you doing?" "You're walking." He turned to face me. His brown eyes were razor-sharp, holding a level of clarity and fierce intelligence that made me take a step back. "Keep your voice down, Claire," he said. His tone was perfectly steady, completely devoid of the confusion my father insisted was taking over his mind. "We do not have much time to waste, and I need you to listen to me very carefully." He walked over to the heavy medical wheelchair my father had hauled into the apartment. He knelt beside it, pulling at the thick black cushion resting on the seat. With a sharp tug, he ripped open a hidden seam along the back edge of the fabric. It had been meticulously sliced and temporarily stitched back together. He reached his hand deep into the foam padding and pulled out a large manila envelope wrapped tightly in clear plastic. Your father did not take your sister to Aspen just for a family vacation, Walter said, his voice tightening with a mixture of profound anger and deep sorrow. Richard is hiding from his creditors, Claire, and he is doing it by stealing my house. The room seemed to spin. I dropped the dish towel onto the counter. I felt the blood drain from my face as the gravity of his words hung in the quiet apartment. Stealing your house, I repeated, trying to force my brain to catch up with this impossible situation. Grandpa, what are you talking about? Dad said he was managing your estate because you were forgetting to pay the bills. Walter let out a bitter, humorless laugh. He handed me the plastic-wrapped envelope. The plastic was still warm from being hidden inside the chair. I am not losing my mind, Claire, he said, looking me dead in the eye. I have never missed a bill in my life. Your father started telling everyone I had dementia so that nobody would question why he suddenly needed to take over my finances. He isolated me in his house so I could not talk to my old neighbors or go to my own bank. He took my cell phone tonight because he knows exactly what is inside this envelope, and he knows that if I get a hold of a phone, I am calling the police. I took the envelope from his hands. My fingers were trembling. I walked over to my small dining table, where my laptop and my accounting ledgers were still open. I turned on the bright desk lamp and carefully peeled away the plastic wrapping. I opened the manila envelope and slid the contents onto the table. There were 2 thick stacks of paper. The first was a series of bank statements from a major national lender. The second was a property deed, a formal legal document recorded with the county clerk. I am a financial controller. I have spent my entire adult life looking at legal contracts, verifying asset transfers, and hunting down discrepancies in corporate ledgers. It only took my professional eyes a few seconds to scan the top page of the property deed and realize that I was looking at a monumental, staggering piece of real estate fraud. It was a quitclaim deed. The document officially transferred the title of Walter, a beautiful colonial estate, the home he had owned free and clear for decades, to a new legal entity. The grantor was listed as Walter. The grantee, the new owner of the property, was listed as RM Holdings Limited Liability Company. I knew that company name. It was the shell corporation my father had set up a few years ago for his vague consulting business. He had transferred his own father $1 million home directly into his own corporate entity. But a property transfer like this requires a notarized signature. I flipped to the last page of the deed, my eyes landing on the signature line. It spelled out Walter, a full legal name. To an untrained eye, it might have looked legitimate. But I knew my grandfather handwriting. More importantly, I knew how elderly hands behave on paper. Walter had a slight tremor in his right hand. His real signature always had a faint hesitation on the loops of his letters. The signature on this legal deed was perfectly smooth. It was a single confident, continuous stroke. It was a trace job. And a sloppy one at that. Grandpa, this is a forgery, I said, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. You never signed this document in front of a notary. Of course I did not. Walter said, stepping closer to the table and pointing at the date stamped on the top corner. Look at the date, Claire. October 12th. Do you remember where I was on October 12th? I thought back frantically. October 12th was the day my father told me Walter had suffered a minor fall and needed to be kept sedated in the hospital for observation. My father had specifically told me not to visit because Walter needed absolute rest. He had you drugged in a hospital bed. I realized the horror of the situation washing over me like ice water. He forged the deed while you were incapacitated, and he probably bribed a notary or found a corrupt one to stamp it. Walter nodded, his face pale but resolute. He stole the title to my home, Claire. But that is not even the worst of it. Look at the bank statements. I set the forged deed aside and pulled the stack of bank documents under the desk lamp. My eyes darted across the rows of numbers, the interest rates, the collateral terms, and the disbursement schedules. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter with every line I read. Richard had not just stolen the title to the house. He had weaponized it. Using RM Holdings as the legal owner, my father had gone to a hard money lender. a private predatory lending firm that operates outside traditional banking regulations and approves massive loans quickly if the collateral is high enough. Richard had used Walter, a $1.2 million house, as collateral to take out a staggering $800,000 short-term cash loan. I flipped through the transaction history to see where that $800,000 had gone. The money had been bleeding out of the LLC account in massive chunks over the last 2 months. There was a wire transfer for $50,000 to a luxury event planner. There was a payment of $35,000 to an exclusive floral boutique. There was an enormous withdrawal of $120,000 to a luxury exotic car dealership. I covered my mouth with my hand. The lavish wedding preparations for Brittany. The brand new Porsche that Chad was suddenly driving. The sudden influx of wealth my parents had been flaunting all autumn. None of it was real. My father had not struck it rich with his consulting business. He was funding his golden child a perfect life and buying his way into a wealthy family by draining every single drop of equity out of his own father a home. He spent it all. I whispered, staring at the zero balance at the bottom of the final page. He spent $800,000 in 60 days to impress Chad, a family. Walter rested his hand on my shoulder. Read the loan terms, Claire. Read the default clause. I shuffled the papers until I found the original promissory note. Hard money loans are notoriously dangerous because they carry exorbitant interest rates and are structured with a massive balloon payment at the end of a very short term. I traced my finger down the page until I hit the repayment schedule. My heart stopped. The entire principal balance plus $40,000 in interest was due in full on January 2nd. If the payment was not made, the predatory lender had the absolute legal right to seize the collateral immediately. They would foreclose on Walter a house, take possession of the property, and evict anyone living inside. January 2nd, I said, my voice trembling as I looked up at my grandfather. That is next week. That is 8 days from now. Walter nodded slowly. Now, do you understand why he dumped me here tonight? The pieces of my father, a sinister puzzle, slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The Aspen trip was not just a vacation to bond with Chad, a family. It was an alibi. My father knew the loan was about to default. He knew he did not have $800,000 to pay back the lender. His only way out was to sell the house to a cash buyer before the January 2nd deadline to cover the debt and walk away clean. And Chad's parents were extremely wealthy real estate investors who bought properties with cash. My father was going to use this New Year's Eve party to sell the stolen house directly to Chad's parents, but he could not have real estate agents, appraisers, and potential buyers walking through the estate while the real owner was sitting in the living room. He needed Walter completely out of the picture. He needed Walter isolated, cut off from a phone, and unable to tell anyone that the house was being sold out from under him. He threw you here with me, I said, feeling a sudden surge of pure righteous rage building in my chest. He told me you were helpless. He told me not to call him unless someone was dying. He wanted you locked in this apartment so he could finalize the sale behind your back and hand over the keys on New Year's Eve. He thinks I am stupid, Walter said, his voice vibrating with a quiet, furious dignity. He thinks because my body is old, my mind is weak. He left his briefcase unlocked in his home office 3 days ago. I found these documents, copied them, and hid them in the chair. I knew he was going to try to move me before the end of the month. I just needed to get to you, Claire. You are the only one in this family who actually understands how these financial crimes work. You are the only one who can help me stop him. I looked down at the stack of evidence illuminating the dark, undeniable truth of my father, a betrayal. For 29 years, I had believed I was the problem in our family. I believed I was the difficult child, the unlovable daughter, the one who had to work herself to the bone just to earn a crumb of basic respect. But looking at the forged signature on that deed, I finally saw Richard for exactly who he was. He was not a strict father. He was a monster. He was a man willing to render his own elderly father homeless just to buy social status for his favorite daughter. I carefully gathered the bank statements and the forged deed and placed them back into the manila folder. I did not feel scared anymore. The intimidation my father had held over me my entire life evaporated in that instant. I looked up at my grandfather and saw the absolute trust in his eyes. "We are not going to just stop him, Grandpa," I said, my voice hardening with a resolve I had never felt before. "We are going to destroy him." I pulled my laptop toward me and opened a new encrypted browser window. I glanced at the digital clock on the stove. It was 1 a.m. on Christmas Day. My father thought he had outsmarted us all. He thought he had neatly tied up his loose ends and secured his perfect wealthy future. But he had made one massive fatal mistake. He had handed the evidence of his federal crimes directly to a professional accountant, and he had given me exactly 8 days to build a trap he would never see coming. Morning broke over Boston with a harsh, glaring light reflecting off 3 feet of fresh snow. I had not slept a single minute. While my grandfather rested quietly in my bedroom, I sat glued to my kitchen chair, wrapped in a heavy blanket. The bright screen of my laptop was the only source of warmth in the freezing room. I rubbed my exhausted eyes and made the mistake of picking up my phone. My social media feed automatically refreshed, and there was my sister Brittany. She had just posted a carousel of photos from Aspen. The first picture showed her and Chad clinking crystal champagne flutes over a silver tray piled high with expensive caviar. The caption read that she was waking up in a winter wonderland with her future husband and feeling incredibly blessed. I stared at her perfectly manicured hand resting against Chad's expensive ski jacket. They were smiling the carefree smiles of people who believed they were untouchable. They were literally eating caviar funded by the stolen equity of an 82-year-old man. I felt a surge of physical nausea. I tossed the phone face down onto the kitchen counter. I did not have time to feel sick. I had work to do. I am a freelance bookkeeper and financial controller. My entire professional life is built on finding the missing pieces of complex financial puzzles. I know exactly how to track money. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, opened a fresh spreadsheet on my laptop, and began my deep dive into the digital footprint of RM Holdings Limited Liability Company. Using the account numbers and routing details from the bank statement Walter had handed me, I accessed the public county clerk records and the state registry of businesses. It was a painstaking, meticulous process. I cross-referenced property tax histories, title transfers, and corporate filings. The digital trail my father left behind was arrogant and sloppy. He assumed no one with actual financial literacy would ever look at these documents. He assumed my grandfather would just quietly fade away in a nursing home, taking the truth to his grave. As I mapped out the flow of stolen money, my mind was violently pulled back 10 years to the day I got accepted into a prestigious state university. I remembered sitting in my parents' kitchen holding my acceptance letter, feeling a rare moment of pure pride. I had begged my father to co-sign a simple student loan. He had looked at me with cold, flat eyes and said I was not worth an investment. He told me I was too ordinary, too plain, too average to warrant risking his credit score. I was forced to take on massive high-interest student debt, working 3 jobs just to survive, while Brittany got a fully funded ride through a private liberal arts college. He had convinced me I was a financial burden. Yet here I was, 10 years later, staring at the screen and watching my father commit massive federal fraud to fund my sister's lavish lifestyle. The deeper I dug into the transaction history, the darker the reality became. The predatory loan secured by my grandfather's house was just the tip of the iceberg. I started pulling the transaction histories from Walter's retirement accounts. My grandfather had worked his entire life as a public school teacher, carefully building a solid pension and a healthy individual retirement account. I noticed a massive discrepancy dated 14 months ago. There was a direct wire transfer of $150,000, completely draining Walter's largest mutual fund. I traced the routing number of the receiving account. It did not go to a medical facility. It did not go to an assisted living provider. The money had been wired directly into the operating account of a tech startup based in Silicon Valley. I ran a quick background check on the corporate officers of that specific startup. The primary shareholder and chief executive officer was Chad. My sister's arrogant fiancé had launched a failing software company that was bleeding cash. My father had illegally authorized the withdrawal of $150,000 from Walter's life savings to bail out his future son-in-law. Richard was bleeding his own father dry just to buy Chad's loyalty and ensure Brittany married into wealth. The sheer hypocrisy of it took my breath away. My father had refused to help me buy college textbooks, but he was willing to commit felony elder abuse to fund a tech entrepreneur's vanity project. My fingers flew across the keyboard, saving every document, taking screenshots, downloading every single PDF, and building an impenetrable fortress of evidence. I spent 10 straight hours sitting at that table, turning my father's financial arrogance into a weapon he would never be able to defeat. Every line item I uncovered was another betrayal. Every fraudulent transfer was another lie. I compiled a digital dossier so comprehensive that no defense attorney in the world would be able to dismantle it. By 4:00 in the afternoon, the sun was already starting to set behind the Boston skyline, casting long gray shadows across my apartment. I had completely isolated the flow of the stolen money. I had everything. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. The harsh vibration startled me so badly, I nearly knocked over my coffee cup. I picked up the phone. It was a text message from my father. There was a PDF document attached to the message. The text below the attachment was written with his usual commanding cruelty. "Print this and make the old man sign it immediately. He is senile, so do not try to explain it. Just tell him it is for his Medicare benefits. I need this scanned and emailed back to me by 5:00. Do not fail me, Claire." I downloaded the attachment and opened it on my phone screen. My blood ran completely cold. It was not a medical form. It was a general power of attorney document. It was legally drafted to grant Richard absolute and total control over every single asset, legal decision, and real estate transaction involving Walter. My mind raced as I connected the final piece of his sinister puzzle. The predatory loan my father had taken out against the house was due on January 2nd. He was planning to sell the house to Chad's wealthy parents at the New Year's Eve party, to clear the debt and walk away with the remaining cash. But a title company and a closing attorney would require the actual homeowner to sign the final sale documents. Because the initial deed transfer into the shell company was a forgery, my father knew it would not hold up to intense scrutiny during a legitimate closing process. He needed a valid, airtight power of attorney to legally sign the final closing documents on Walter's behalf. He needed to stand in front of the buyers and the lawyers and sign away the house without Walter ever being in the room. He was trying to use me to accomplish the final step of his crime. He wanted me to trick my own grandfather into signing away his legal rights. I did not reply to the message. I sat perfectly still watching the digital clock on my laptop click to 4:15. I needed time to think. I needed to formulate a plan that would protect Walter without tipping off my father that we knew everything. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Richard. I let it ring. It rang again, and then a third time. Finally, a new text message appeared on my screen. The words were so vicious they practically jumped off the glass. "I know you are reading this, Claire. You have exactly 35 minutes to send me that signed document. If I do not have it in my inbox by 5:00, I am calling the Boston police. I will tell them you took your grandfather against my explicit medical directives. I have his primary care doctor on speed dial, and I will report you for kidnapping a vulnerable adult. You will spend Christmas night in a holding cell, and I will have him placed in a state facility by morning. Print the document and get it signed right now." My father was not just a thief. He was a ruthless manipulator cornered by his own massive debts. He knew the hard money lender was going to foreclose in just a few days. He knew his entire house of cards was about to collapse, and he was perfectly willing to destroy my life and throw me in a jail cell just to save himself. I looked toward the bedroom door. Walter was awake now, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking out at the falling snow. He had entrusted me with his life. He had handed me the truth when no one else would listen. My father thought he held all the cards. He thought his threat of police intervention would paralyze me with fear. But he had completely miscalculated who he was dealing with. I was no longer the frightened teenager begging for a student loan. I was a professional auditor holding a mountain of federal evidence. The clock was ticking down to 5:00, and the deadline for the house foreclosure was looming just days away. The time for being the quiet, compliant daughter was officially over. The war had just begun. The drive back to my cramped apartment was a suffocating blur of panic and adrenaline. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my fingers ached, and my mind kept flashing back to the bright crimson fabric of my scarf blowing in the freezing wind caught high in the thorns of the rosebush. My parents would find it. They would know I had been there. But I could not afford to let fear paralyze me now. I had a narrow window of time before they formulated their next move, and I had to strike first. I slammed the door of my apartment, deadbolted it, and threw my wet coat onto the floor. I did not even bother to turn on the overhead lights. I went straight to my small kitchen table, flipped open my laptop, and let the harsh white light of the screen illuminate the dark room. I was about to unleash a financial counterattack. During those frantic stolen minutes in my grandmother's bedroom, I had done more than just hide a burner phone in her antique sewing box. I had used my own cell phone to record a voice memo. I needed a failsafe. In the recording, my grandmother sounded weak, but her mind was completely lucid. I had asked her to clearly state her full name, her date of birth, and her explicit verbal consent, granting me full authorization to access and review her personal banking records. I had also managed to hastily copy down her primary account numbers and her social security number from an old tax document she kept hidden under her mattress. Armed with that recording and those numbers, I was ready to tear down the wall of lies my parents had built. I navigated to the portal of the premier wealth management bank that held my grandmother's trust and retirement accounts. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Because I had practically run her finances years ago before my parents swooped in and pushed me out, I still remembered the answers to her security questions. Her first pet was a beagle named Buster. Her childhood street was Elmwood Drive. The system accepted the answers and prompted me to create a new password. I bypassed the two-factor authentication by routing the confirmation code to an old email address of hers that I had set up and still controlled. The screen loaded a spinning blue circle appearing for what felt like an eternity before the main dashboard finally materialized. What I saw on that screen made the breath leave my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. The financial bleeding was not just bad. It was absolutely catastrophic. My grandmother had spent 50 years working as a senior administrator for a major pharmaceutical company. She had built a massive retirement portfolio meant to guarantee her comfort and security until the end of her life. But the balances staring back at me were decimated. The primary checking account, which used to hold a comfortable safety net, was hovering just above zero. I clicked into the transaction history and began to download months of PDF statements. I am a medical billing specialist. I spend 40 hours a week hunting down phantom charges and exposing fraudulent insurance claims. I know how to follow a paper trail better than anyone, and what my parents had done was a masterclass in sociopathic theft. I scrolled through the line items, my eyes burning as the sheer scale of their greed unfolded before me. There were tens of thousands of dollars funneled out under the memo line of caregiver expenses and medical supplies. But the routing numbers and merchant codes told a completely different story. I saw a recurring monthly withdrawal of $1,200, categorized as a specialized mobility transport service. I cross-referenced the routing number with a corporate database and found that it was actually the lease payment for my father's brand-new luxury Mercedes SUV. My stomach churned with a sickening mixture of rage and disgust. I kept scrolling, digging deeper into the financial slaughter. There was a payment for $4,000 labeled as an in-home physical therapy consultation. The merchant code belonged to the elite Oak Ridge Country Club, paying for my parents' exclusive membership dues. There were massive withdrawals listed as residential memory care upgrades, which were actually funding their lavish shopping sprees at high-end boutiques and paying off their suffocating credit card debts. The most repulsive discovery was a $10,000 charge categorized as out-of-state respite care. I recognized the vendor immediately. It was a luxury 5-star resort in the Bahamas. They had taken a tropical vacation with my grandmother's money while leaving her locked in a dark room, heavily sedated and completely alone. They were systematically draining her life savings to fund the exact premium lifestyle they had accused me of wanting. They had projected their own parasitic greed onto me to deflect attention from their massive, ongoing theft. The spreadsheet of expenses they had shoved in my face at Thanksgiving, demanding I pay them back rent for my childhood, was nothing but a desperate attempt to squeeze a few extra drops of blood from a stone because they were rapidly burning through their stolen fortune. I could not sit still. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking with a furious, aggressive energy. I dialed the toll-free number for the bank's fraud prevention department. I navigated the endless robotic menu, pressing 0 repeatedly until the automated voice finally placed me in the queue to speak with a human being. The hold music played a soft, classical tune that felt incredibly mocking given the severe criminal emergency I was trying to report. After 20 agonizing minutes, a bank manager finally answered the line. Her name was Brenda, and her tone was polite but dripping with bureaucratic exhaustion. I quickly identified myself and explained the situation, keeping my voice as clinical and professional as possible. I told her I was the granddaughter of the account holder and that I had uncovered massive financial irregularities, including unauthorized transfers and blatant embezzlement disguised as medical expenses. I told her I had recorded verbal consent from my grandmother authorizing me to act on her behalf. Brenda asked for the account number. I read it to her and waited, listening to the rhythmic clicking of her keyboard through the phone line. The typing suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and completely unaccommodating. "I am looking at the profile now, Miss Jenkins," Brenda said, her tone shifting from polite exhaustion to cold corporate hostility. "And I see absolutely no authorization for you to access this account or discuss its contents." "I have her verbal consent," I insisted, pressing the phone hard against my ear. "I can send you the audio recording right now. She is being held against her will and heavily medicated by the current residents of the house. You have to freeze the outward flow of cash immediately. They are stealing her retirement." "I cannot do that," Brenda replied, her voice hardening into an impenetrable wall of protocol. "The only individuals authorized to manage this account or make financial decisions are Robert and Patricia Jenkins. They are listed as the primary account managers." "That is impossible," I argued, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. She never would have handed over total control of her finances to them. She knew they had a history of bankruptcy. "It does not matter what you believe," Miss Jenkins, Brenda stated coldly. "I am looking at a fully executed, durable power of attorney filed and verified by our legal department 6 months ago. It grants Robert and Patricia Jenkins absolute unilateral control over all financial assets, real estate holdings, and medical directives for the account holder. As far as this institution is concerned, your parents are the legally recognized agents. You have zero legal standing here." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. A power of attorney. They had forced her to sign a document surrendering her entire life to them. Or more likely, they had heavily drugged her with those illicit pills from the cash, only doctor until she was completely incapacitated, and then guided her trembling hand across the signature line. They had built an impenetrable legal fortress around their theft. "Listen to me," I pleaded, desperation bleeding into my voice. "That document is fraudulent. It was obtained under extreme medical duress. They are using a dirty doctor to sedate her. If you just look at the transaction history, you will see the money is not going to medical care. It is going to luxury car dealerships and resorts. You have a fiduciary duty to flag this as elder financial abuse. If you continue to access this account portal without authorization," Brenda interrupted, her voice echoing with a sharp, menacing warning, "I will be the one flagging you for elder financial abuse. Unauthorized digital access to a vulnerable adult's financial portal is a federal crime. I strongly suggest you log out immediately. Miss Jenkins, if you have a problem with the power of attorney, take it up with the family courts. Good day." The line went dead. A dial tone buzzed in my ear, replacing the only hope I had of stopping the bleeding. I pulled the phone away from my face, staring at the dark screen. The law, the very system designed to protect the vulnerable, was currently shielding the abusers. My parents had weaponized the legal system and the banking protocols to legitimize their embezzlement. I was completely locked out. I slammed my fist against the kitchen table, rattling my cold coffee mug. I wanted to scream in frustration. I turned back to my laptop screen, staring at the digital dashboard of my grandmother's ruined finances. Brenda had told me to log out, but I refused. I was not going to run away just because a bank manager threatened me with a policy manual. If they were going to accuse me of cybercrimes, I was going to make sure I extracted every single piece of evidence I could find before they locked me out of the system forever. I clicked over to the Pending Transactions tab, intending to download the raw data files for the current billing cycle. The page refreshed, and a new line item populated at the very top of the screen. It had not been there 10 minutes ago. It must have just been submitted through an automated clearinghouse process. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the text. My breath completely hitched in my throat. It was a pending wire transfer slated to clear at the start of the next business day. The amount was staggering: $25,000. I looked at the beneficiary name. It was not a car dealership. It was not a country club or a tropical resort. It was an individual named Marcus Vance, operating under a private business license. I quickly opened a new browser tab and searched the name against the state licensing registry. The results came back instantly. Marcus Vance was a licensed public notary operating a mobile business that specialized in expedited legal documents and real estate closings. I switched back to the banking portal and looked at the memo line attached to the massive $25,000 payment. The text was brief, but it carried the weight of an execution order. Final deed processing. The room seemed to spin around me. A $25,000 payment to a mobile notary public was not a standard administrative fee. It was a massive illegal bribe. My parents had realized their stolen cash reserves were running dry, and they were making their ultimate move. They were paying a dirty notary under the table to stamp and authorize a forged real estate document. They were not just draining her checking accounts anymore. They were finalizing the transfer of the $1.5 million estate. They were going to sell the house right out from under her, take the millions in cash, and leave my grandmother completely destitute and at the mercy of the state. The clock was not just ticking anymore. It was completely running out. The morning of December 27th was bitterly cold, but the atmosphere inside Thomas Gallagher, a downtown law office, was electric. We were not just drafting legal documents, we were building an impenetrable fortress. Walter sat at the heavy mahogany conference table, looking more alive and focused than I had seen him in a decade. He held a heavy gold fountain pen in his hand, and there was an absolute, undeniable fire in his eyes. Thomas slid a thick stack of papers across the polished wood. It was the irrevocable trust. As a financial controller, I understood exactly how lethal this specific instrument was in the realm of asset protection. By signing his name, Walter was legally transferring every single remaining dollar of his liquid assets, every investment account, every pension disbursement, and every mutual fund out of his personal name and into a locked legal vault. More importantly, the trust named me as the sole trustee and explicitly revoked any previous permissions granted to my father. Richard was completely and permanently locked out. The moment the ink dried on the parchment, Thomas had his senior paralegal physically march the original documents down to the main branch of Walter Bank. The bank managers who had known Walter personally for over 30 years immediately froze the old accounts. They severed the digital connections and moved the funds into the new secure trust. In the blink of an eye, Richard debit cards, Richard automated payment schedules, and Richard unrestricted access to Walter, a life savings, simply vanished into thin air. Every financial pipeline my father had relied upon to fund his luxurious charade was completely shut off. But Thomas did not stop there. The trust secured the cash, but the colonial estate was still sitting on a ticking time bomb of a predatory hard money loan. To permanently block the cash sale to Chad, a wealthy parents Thomas filed a lis pendens directly with the county clerk. A lis pendens is a formal public legal notice attached to a property title declaring that the house is the subject of active and severe litigation. I watched Thomas confidently stamp the filing and felt a shiver of pure anticipation run down my spine. I knew exactly what that piece of paper meant in the ruthless world of commercial real estate. It made the property completely radioactive. No legitimate title insurance company on the planet would ever underwrite a policy on a house with an active lis pendens attached to it. No closing attorney would allow a buyer to sign the final transfer papers, knowing a massive federal fraud investigation was looming over the property. We had effectively paralyzed the estate. Richard could host all the lavish New Year Eve closing parties he wanted. He could pour expensive champagne and smile for the cameras pretending to be a self-made millionaire, but the house was legally unsellable. We had trapped him inside his own arrogant scheme. We returned to my cramped apartment later that afternoon, and the waiting game began. The trap was set. The tripwires were pulled tight across my father, a perfect high society illusion. All we had to do now was wait for him to step on them. I made a pot of hot tea and sat at the small kitchen table with my grandfather. The snow was still piled high against the windows, casting a soft white glow across the room, but the suffocating dread that had crushed me on Christmas Eve was entirely gone. Walter took a slow sip of his tea and looked around my tiny living room. He told me he was proud of me. He said he was deeply sorry he had not seen through my father a manipulation much sooner. For years, Richard had carefully managed Walter an environment keeping him isolated, making him doubt his own memory and gaslighting him into believing he needed constant supervision. My father had systematically stripped away Walter autonomy while simultaneously making me feel like an ungrateful, worthless burden who did not deserve a college education. As I listened to my grandfather speak, I realized how deeply my father's lies had infected both of our lives. When I was applying for college and begging for a simple co-signature on a student loan, Richard had looked at me with cold eyes and told me I was a bad investment. He forced me into years of grueling jobs and crushing debt, while he secretly siphoned a fortune from Walter to buy his way into a wealthy social circle. We had both been victims of the exact same predator, just trapped in different cages. But as we sat there sharing stories and piecing together the timeline of my father, a deceit, I realized we were no longer victims. We were the architects of his downfall. We sat in companionable silence, listening to the wind rattle the window panes, knowing that 2,000 miles away in the snowy peaks of Colorado, a massive financial earthquake was about to hit my father. The eruption happened the very next day. It was just past 2 p.m. when my cell phone shattered the quiet peace of the apartment. I looked down at the bright screen. The caller ID flashed Richard. My heart gave a heavy, anxious thump against my ribs, but I took a deep, steadying breath, forced my tense shoulders to relax, and tapped the answer button. I did not even get a chance to say a simple hello. "Claire, what the hell is going on?" my father bellowed through the speaker. His voice was so loud and so completely unhinged that I had to pull the phone an inch away from my ear. I could hear the chaotic clatter of fine silverware and the loud murmur of wealthy voices in the background. He was clearly in a very public, high-end place. I kept my voice perfectly flat, playing the obedient, quiet role he had assigned me my entire life. "What do you mean, Dad? Is something wrong out there?" "I am at the Alpine Lodge," he screamed, referring to one of the most exclusive and ridiculously expensive 5-star restaurants in all of Aspen. I just tried to pay for a $4,000 engagement lunch for Chad, an entire extended family, and my card was declined. "Every single card linked to your grandfather A accounts is coming back as frozen. The bank manager is telling me I am no longer an authorized user on any of the funds." "What did you do?" I leaned back in my kitchen chair and allowed myself a small, genuine smile. I pictured my arrogant father standing in front of a massive table full of wealthy elites, holding a useless piece of plastic, while a manager waited expectantly for a working payment method. The sheer humiliation must have been burning him alive. He had spent his entire life making me feel small and poor, and now he was the one standing penniless in front of the people he desperately wanted to impress. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Dad," I said, injecting just the right amount of naive confusion into my tone. "I am just a freelance bookkeeper, remember? I do not have access to his secure banking portal. Maybe it is just a routine holiday bank fraud alert. You know how strict banks get when suddenly there are massive unexpected charges in another state. They probably locked the accounts down to protect him from theft." "Do not play games with me, Claire," he snarled, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening whisper. "You are supposed to be watching him. Did he call the bank? Did you let him near a telephone today?" "How could he do that?" I asked, my voice dripping with innocent concern. "You took his cell phone right before you left to make sure he was disconnected. And you told me he was too confused to understand anything anyway. He has just been watching television all day. Do you want me to try calling the customer service line for you? I am sure it is just a simple misunderstanding that we can clear up." The silence on the other end of the line was thick and heavy with mounting panic. My father was rapidly realizing that his absolute control over the family narrative was slipping through his fingers. He had maxed out his own personal credit years ago, living far beyond his actual means. He had been floating his entire luxurious existence on Walter, stolen funds. Without those cards, he could not pay for the expensive ski chalet, he could not buy the lavish dinners, and he certainly could not keep up the grand illusion of wealth he desperately needed to maintain. The walls were rapidly closing in on him, and I could hear the pure desperation cracking through his usual arrogant facade. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat, Richard," hissed the mask, completely gone now. "I am not dealing with this incompetence from 2,000 miles away. You have completely screwed up the one simple favor I asked of you. I am booking a flight back to Boston right now." "But Dad, what about the rest of your luxury vacation?" I asked, suppressing the profound satisfaction bubbling in my chest. "What about Brittany, a grand celebration with her future in-laws?" "Shut up, Claire." He snapped, the venom in his voice absolute. "I am coming back early and I am taking over. I am taking him out of your miserable little apartment, and I am putting him in a full-time secure medical facility where he belongs. A place where nobody gets to talk to him without my explicit written permission. You are completely useless. Do not leave that apartment. Do not let anyone inside. If you cause me one more problem, I will ruin you." He hung up the phone with a violent, furious click. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the screen. My father thought he was terrifying me. He thought he was regaining control by threatening to fly back and lock my grandfather away in a facility. He did not realize that coming back early was exactly what we needed him to do. The trap was fully armed and the predator was rushing blindly toward the bait. The morning of December 29th brought a bitter, biting wind that violently rattled the window panes of my apartment. I was sitting at my small kitchen table drinking a cup of dark coffee and reviewing the final confirmation documents from Thomas Gallagher when the heavy rumble of a massive engine broke the winter silence outside. I walked over to the frosted window and wiped away the thick condensation with the sleeve of my sweater. A black luxury sport utility vehicle was idling aggressively in the street below my building. My father had kept his promise. He had cut his luxurious Aspen vacation short to come back and handle his missing asset. 4 car doors opened almost simultaneously. Richard stepped out first, his face flushed with a mixture of burning anger and the biting winter cold. My mother Diane followed closely, pulling her expensive designer coat tightly around her shoulders and staring at my building with absolute revulsion. My sister Brittany and her arrogant fiancé Chad emerged next, looking completely miserable to be dragged back to the freezing Boston suburbs right in the middle of their holiday. But there was a 5th person. A man I had never seen before slid out of the 3rd row of the large vehicle. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit and carried a scuffed plastic clipboard. He looked incredibly nervous, scanning my quiet neighborhood with visible disdain. I knew exactly who he was. This was the representative from whatever low-rent, locked-down medical facility my father had bribed to take Walter on such incredibly short notice. The security buzzer downstairs rang with a harsh grating sound, followed immediately by violent, furious pounding on the heavy wood of my front door. They had bypassed the main gate by tailgating a neighbor inside the building. I did not panic. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothed down my sweater, and walked purposefully to the entryway. I opened the door, stepped out onto the freezing concrete landing, and pulled the door firmly shut behind me, hearing the heavy deadbolt slide securely into place. I stood entirely alone on the small porch, blocking the only entrance to my home. Richard stopped dead in his tracks at the bottom of the short staircase. He looked up at me with eyes full of absolute unhinged fury. "Open that door, Claire," he demanded, his voice echoing loudly off the brick walls of the surrounding apartment buildings. "We are taking him right now. You have absolutely no legal right to hold him in there. He has severe dementia and requires professional 24-hour supervision." My mother stood shivering just behind him, crossing her arms over her chest. "Do not make this a public spectacle, Claire," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly from the freezing wind. "You are embarrassing us in front of Mr. Higgins." She gestured to the nervous man holding the clipboard. "Mr. Higgins here has graciously arranged a secure room at the Sunny Pines Care Center. We are transferring Walter immediately so your sister and Chad can get back to their vacation." I kept my hands buried deep in my pockets, ignoring the bitter wind whipping through my hair. "Grandpa is perfectly safe exactly where he is," I said, my tone remaining absolutely calm. "He is resting comfortably, and he has absolutely no desire to leave this apartment today." Richard took a threatening step up the concrete stairs, his face turning a dark shade of crimson. "I am his designated medical proxy," he shouted, pointing a thick finger right at my face. "I make the decisions about his care. He is not capable of making choices for himself. You are illegally detaining a vulnerable senior citizen. If you do not step aside and unlock that door right this second, I will call the police and press charges against you." He pulled his smartphone out of his heavy winter coat and waved it at me like a weapon. A week ago, that precise threat would have paralyzed me completely. A week ago, I would have stepped aside, apologized profusely, and let them trample all over me just to avoid the overwhelming anxiety of a family conflict. But standing on that icy porch, looking down at the man who was actively trying to steal his own father a legacy, I felt nothing but profound pity for his sheer pathetic desperation. "Call them," I said, my voice completely level and steady. "Please dial 911 right now, Dad. Tell the emergency dispatcher you want to force an 82-year-old man out of a warm apartment into a freezing car totally against his will. I am sure the police would love to arrive and review his official medical records to see exactly who has been authorizing his care." Richard hesitated, his thumb hovering nervously over the dark screen. He knew he could not risk having local law enforcement show up and start asking difficult questions about Walter. Seeing my father visibly falter, Chad decided it was the perfect time to step up and save the day. He adjusted the wide collar of his expensive cashmere overcoat and stepped deliberately in front of Richard, looking up at me with a deeply arrogant, condescending smirk. He was a junior partner at a prestigious corporate law firm, and he clearly believed he could effortlessly bully a freelance bookkeeper using a few intimidating legal phrases. "Listen to me very carefully, Claire." Chad began using the slow, patronizing tone he undoubtedly reserved for opposing counsel, he deemed entirely beneath him. "You are currently in violation of several serious legal statutes. By preventing Richard from accessing his father, you are actively committing tortious interference with a medical conservatorship. If you force me to file a writ of habeas corpus to compel his release, I will personally sue you for every single penny you have ever made. I will tie you up in civil court for the next 10 years and absolutely destroy your pathetic little accounting business." I looked down at him, feeling a cold, genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. Chad was entirely out of his depth. He was a corporate transaction lawyer trying to bluff his way through a complex family dispute using completely fabricated legal terminology. "Tortious interference with a medical conservatorship," I repeated, shaking my head slowly in mock disappointment. "That is an incredibly creative string of words, Chad. But there is a massive fundamental problem with your aggressive little threat. A medical conservatorship requires a judge to formally declare an individual incompetent after a rigorous and documented psychological evaluation. I ran a full comprehensive search of the county probate records yesterday morning. No judge has ever declared Walter incompetent. There is no conservatorship. You are making up legal terms to intimidate me on my own front porch. Chad visibly swallowed his smug grin, fading instantly into a look of genuine confusion. Brittany looked at him, her perfectly manicured brow furrowed in frustration. "Chad," she whined, pulling anxiously at his cashmere sleeve. "What is she talking about? Just make her open the door." Chad ignored her, pointing a rigid finger at me. "Richard is his legal power of attorney." Chad countered, his voice rising slightly in uncharacteristic panic. "He has the absolute legal authority to dictate Walter a medical placement and financial decisions. You are actively obstructing a legally appointed representative." "Actually?" "Chad," I replied, taking a deliberate, confident step forward to the very edge of the concrete stairs. "Richard does not have a power of attorney. In order for a power of attorney to be legally binding, it must be voluntarily signed by the principal in the physical presence of a certified notary public. Since Walter never signed that document, and since I never printed it or emailed it back to my father, the specific document you are referring to is completely, totally void. Richard has absolutely no legal authority over my grandfather." Chad's mouth opened and closed, but no actual words came out. He looked back at Richard, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. Richard had clearly lied to Chad and his wealthy parents about having total and unencumbered control over the estate. The nervous representative from the care facility took 2 large, staggering steps backward, retreating quickly toward the safety of the street. "I am not getting involved in a contested family custody dispute," the man stammered, clutching his plastic clipboard tightly against his chest. "Call me when you have an actual court order, Mr. Myers." The man turned his collar up to the wind and walked rapidly down the icy sidewalk, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the legal nightmare I had just casually exposed. Richard lunged forward, grabbing the freezing iron railing of the staircase with both hands. "You lying, ungrateful little thief," he spat, his voice trembling with a level of genuine hatred that took my breath away. "You think you are so incredibly smart. You think you can just steal him away from us. We will get an emergency injunction from a judge by tomorrow morning." My mother Diane stepped up right beside him, her face twisted into a deeply ugly mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You have always been terribly jealous of Brittany," she hissed venomously. "You have always desperately wanted to ruin her happiness because you are so incredibly miserable and alone. You are deliberately sabotaging her beautiful wedding just to be vindictive." I looked at my mother, feeling a strange, incredibly powerful sense of liberation wash through my entire body. Her cruel words did not hurt me anymore. They were just the empty, desperate noise of a woman who valued a luxury vehicle over the well-being of her own daughter. "I am not sabotaging anything, Mom," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and polite. But since Chad is so extremely fond of complex legal terminology, maybe he can accurately explain the concept of an irrevocable trust to you. The precise moment I spoke those specific words, Richard froze completely solid. The vibrant, angry color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. "An irrevocable trust," I repeated, letting the heavy syllables hang in the freezing winter air. "It is a very powerful, very permanent financial instrument. It locks down all liquid assets, completely protecting them from unauthorized transfers, predatory loans, and greedy family members. It removes all previous authorized users immediately." I smiled warmly down at my paralyzed father. "That is probably exactly why your credit card stopped working at that fancy 5-star restaurant in Aspen, Dad. Your access to the bank accounts has been permanently legally revoked." Richard stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck directly in the chest. He stared up at me, breathing heavily, his mind frantically trying to calculate exactly how much I actually knew about his operations. He knew the massive hard money loan was defaulting in just 4 days. He knew his cash buyer was quickly slipping away. He knew his entire fraudulent empire was actively collapsing right in front of his eyes. Chad, finally realizing the situation was legally and financially radioactive, grabbed Brittany firmly by the arm and pulled her forcefully toward the idling luxury vehicle. "We are leaving," he ordered, his voice tight with undeniable panic. "We are not standing out here freezing to death while your insane family fights over some ridiculous technicality in the cold." Brittany stumbled awkwardly after him, looking back at us with a bewildered, furious expression. Diane stood absolutely frozen, her eyes darting frantically between me and Richard, desperately waiting for my father to somehow fix the catastrophic disaster. But Richard had no brilliant moves left to play. He could not call the police without actively exposing his own massive financial fraud. He could not force his way into my apartment without committing a violent felony in broad daylight. He was entirely, totally legally trapped. He looked up at me from the bottom of the concrete stairs, his face a terrifying portrait of pure, desperate malice. "You have always been a deeply jealous, bitter disappointment, Claire," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, incredibly ugly whisper. "You are completely dead to me. You are officially cut out of this family forever. Do not ever show your face at our New Year's Eve party. Do not ever contact us again." I stood in silence and watched him turn around and march aggressively back to the idling vehicle. Diane followed closely behind him, refusing to even look in my direction again. The four of them climbed quickly into the heavy black sport utility vehicle, slamming the heavy doors shut against the biting winter chill. The powerful engine revved loudly and the vehicle sped away down the snowy street, its tires spinning slightly on the black ice before completely disappearing around the corner. I stood alone on the freezing porch, the biting wind pulling violently at my heavy clothes. My father had delivered his final cruel blow, sincerely hoping to leave me shattered and weeping on my own doorstep. He actually thought that revoking my invitation to his fake family party was the ultimate devastating punishment. He thought he had successfully banished me from their perfect high society world forever. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out my keys, unlocking my front door with a perfectly steady hand. I stepped back into the wonderful, absolute warmth of my apartment, closing the heavy door firmly against the cold outside. A quiet, deeply confident smile spread across my face as I walked back into the living room where my grandfather was waiting patiently for the news. My father had demanded that I never show my face at his lavish New Year's Eve celebration, but he did not realize that I had already marked that specific date on my calendar. I had my financial documents perfectly organized. I had the legal notices officially filed, and I knew with absolute unshakable certainty that his luxurious high society party was exactly where I planned to be. New Year's Eve draped the wealthy suburbs of Boston in a heavy glittering layer of winter frost. While the rest of the city counted down the final hours to fresh starts and midnight resolutions, I was navigating my beat-up 10-year-old sedan through the pristine, winding streets of a neighborhood I was no longer welcome in. The wealth in this specific zip code was not the loud, flashy kind that demanded attention. It was the quiet old money sort that whispered softly from behind wrought iron gates and manicured winter hedges. Tonight, however, my grandfather's estate was making plenty of noise. From a full block away, I could see the soft amber glow spilling out from the massive arched windows of the colonial house. Valet attendants bundled in crisp, dark winter coats were jogging down the long, circular driveway, carefully parking luxury vehicles that cost more than I would make in a decade of freelance bookkeeping. My car heater sputtered and hummed, fighting a completely losing battle against the bitter December chill, but I did not feel the cold creeping into my bones. I felt a steady burning focus radiating from my chest. My father had explicitly forbidden me from showing my face tonight. He had aggressively banished me to my cramped apartment, believing I would stay hidden away out of sheer fear and blind obedience. He had grossly underestimated both of us. I bypassed the long, orderly line of idling expensive cars steering my battered sedan directly toward the main entrance of the estate. A young valet stepped forward, immediately holding up a white-gloved hand, his face crinkling with polite but firm confusion. He clearly assumed I was a lost catering delivery driver, or a confused staff member who had completely missed the designated service entrance around the back. I rolled down my window just enough to let my voice slip out into the freezing air. "We are not parking," I said, keeping my tone completely even and perfectly calm. "We are going straight inside." Before the young man could formulate a proper response, I threw the car into park, right at the base of the grand stone steps, entirely blocking the main arrival lane. The valet opened his mouth to protest the massive breach of protocol, but the words died instantly in his throat as I stepped out into the snow and walked purposefully around to the passenger side of the vehicle. I pulled open the heavy door and offered my arm into the warm cabin. The man who emerged from my battered sedan was not the frail, declining dementia patient my father had been parading around to his elite friends and business partners. The heavy medical wheelchair had been left sitting completely empty back in my living room. Tonight, Walter was wearing a beautifully tailored charcoal suit he had kept meticulously preserved for special occasions. The premium wool fabric hung perfectly on his broad, strong shoulders. He grasped a silver-tipped mahogany cane, planting it firmly on the icy pavement with absolute conviction. When he stood up to his full height, he seemed to fill the entire winter night with his immense presence. He smoothed his silk tie, checked his gold pocket watch, and looked up at the magnificent house he had built with his own 2 hands decades ago. He did not look like an elderly victim of financial exploitation. He looked like a furious king returning from a forced exile to forcefully reclaim his stolen throne. "Are you ready, Grandpa?" I asked, offering my arm for physical support over the slippery stones. He did not take my arm. He did not need it. "I have been ready since the exact moment he forged my name," Walter replied, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that cut straight through the freezing winter wind. "Let us go see exactly what my son is celebrating." We climbed the wide stone steps together side by side. The heavy mahogany double doors were left slightly ajar, letting the warm sound of joyful laughter and live classical music drift out into the falling snow. A hired private security guard in a dark suit stood just inside the main foyer, but he was too busy checking a VIP guest list on a plastic clipboard to notice us push the heavy doors fully open and step over the threshold. The interior transformation of Walter's cherished home was sickeningly extravagant. My mother had clearly spent an absolute fortune of stolen money decorating the grand foyer. Massive cascading arrangements of white winter roses and thick silver ribbons wrapped tightly around the curved wooden banister of the grand staircase. Waiters in pristine, tailored uniforms glided effortlessly across the polished hardwood floors, balancing silver trays of bubbling champagne flutes and delicate, expensive hors d'oeuvres. Through the wide-open archway leading directly into the main living room, I could clearly see roughly 50 guests mingling and laughing. The women wore glittering floor-length evening gowns, and the men sported custom-fitted tuxedos. It was a perfectly executed high society illusion, deliberately designed to project absolute financial success and generational wealth. The air smelled of expensive catering, roasted meats, and heavy designer perfumes. It made my stomach churn knowing every single flower, every drop of champagne, and every hour of the string quartet's time was directly funded by a predatory hard money loan taken out against the very walls surrounding us. We stood quietly in the shadowed edge of the foyer, completely unnoticed by the distracted crowd, for a long, painful minute. My eyes quickly scanned the crowded room and instantly found the center of the arrogant spectacle. My father Richard stood proudly by the massive stone fireplace, basking in the warm, flickering glow of the flames and the rapt, attentive focus of his elite audience. He held a crystal glass in one hand, and my mother Diane stood faithfully at his side, literally dripping in sparkling new diamond jewelry. Beside them stood Brittany, looking absolutely radiant in a custom silk dress, her arm linked tightly with Chad. Surrounding my immediate family was a group of distinctively wealthy older individuals. I recognized Chad's parents immediately from the constant stream of photos Brittany posted online. They possessed that effortless, relaxed posture of people who had never worried about a bank balance or a late fee in their entire lives. They were smiling warmly at my father, completely unaware that the man they were preparing to merge families with was a desperate criminal balancing on the absolute edge of federal ruin. My father raised his hand and tapped a silver spoon gently against the rim of his champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut beautifully through the ambient chatter. The string quartet playing softly in the corner immediately ceased their music, letting the final notes fade into the high ceilings. The 50 guests turned their collective attention toward the fireplace, their lively conversations fading into a respectful, expectant hush. "Thank you all so very much for joining us on this spectacular New Year's Eve," Richard announced, his voice dripping with practiced charm and completely false humility. "As we stand here tonight on the very brink of a fresh year, Diane and I have so incredibly much to be thankful for. We are not just celebrating the dawn of a new calendar year with our dearest friends. We are celebrating a massive, wonderful transition for our growing family." He raised his crystal glass slightly toward Chad's parents, offering them a gracious, highly deferential nod that made my skin crawl with absolute disgust. "Tonight, we officially celebrate the beautiful blending of the Myers and the Hastings families." Richard continued, projecting his voice so every single elite guest in the back of the room could hear him clearly. "But we are also celebrating the successful and incredibly smooth sale of this beautiful historic estate. To officially pass the keys of this magnificent property over to our wonderful new family members is simply the greatest joy of my entire life. To beautiful new beginnings, and to our precious daughter, Brittany." The entire room erupted in polite, enthusiastic applause. Chad's father beamed broadly, raising his own glass and returning the warm toast. Brittany leaned her head gently against Chad's shoulder, playing the role of the perfect, blushing bride-to-be with sickening perfection. My mother wiped a highly performative tear from her eye, soaking in the admiration and respect of the wealthiest people she had ever managed to gather into one room. It was an absolute masterclass in deception. They were celebrating a massive federal felony right out in the open, cloaked perfectly in the elegant disguise of a legitimate real estate transaction and a joyous family union. Walter tightened his grip on the smooth handle of his silver-tipped cane. The sound of their cheerful applause seemed to bounce off the high ceilings, hitting us like a physical insult. I looked at my grandfather and gave a single sharp nod. We stepped out of the dark shadows of the foyer and walked directly into the blinding bright light of the main living room. We did not sneak quietly along the edges of the room. We did not wait for the applause to die down. We walked straight down the exact center aisle of the room, cutting a direct path right through the dense crowd of elite guests. My scuffed winter boots and simple dark coat stood out violently against the sea of designer gowns and tailored silk, but I walked with my chin held high and my shoulders pulled back. Beside me, Walter moved with the heavy, terrifying momentum of an incoming winter storm. The polished hardwood floor heavily amplified the rhythmic, sharp crack of his cane hitting the ground with every single step. A woman in a sequined dress standing near the back of the crowd was the very first person to notice our approach. Her polite applause slowed down and then stopped entirely. She nudged her husband's arm, pointing discreetly at the elderly man striding purposefully into the room. The ripple effect was instantaneous and completely absolute. As we moved forward, the wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, hastily stepping back to clear a wide path for us. The confused murmurs spread incredibly quickly, violently replacing the celebratory cheers with a tense, nervous buzzing. My mother, Diane, was in the exact middle of taking a delicate sip from her expensive champagne flute when her eyes drifted casually across the parting crowd and landed squarely on my face. She froze completely solid. The elegant crystal glass slipped right through her suddenly numb, trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, shattering crash, sending deadly shards of glass and expensive vintage champagne exploding across the polished wood. The sudden violent noise of the breaking glass was the final punctuation mark on their grand illusion. The string quartet did not start playing again. The quiet murmurs abruptly ceased. The entire room went completely dead silent. It was the kind of suffocating heavy silence that presses physically against your eardrums and makes the air feel entirely too thick to breathe. My father slowly lowered his glass, his incredibly arrogant smile melting off his face like hot wax. The vibrant color rushed completely out of his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. He stared directly at me, his eyes wide with absolute horror. And then his frantic gaze shifted slowly to the man standing right beside me. Richard had fully expected to see a broken, confused old man locked away in a cheap apartment miles away from this high society triumph. He expected his father to be isolated and silenced. Instead, he was staring directly at his own father dressed to the nines, fully lucid, and staring back at him with a dark, furious gaze that promised absolute total destruction. Brittany let out a loud, dramatic gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth as she stared at my grandfather. Chad took a confused, uncertain step backward, his legal mind frantically trying to process why the supposedly incapacitated owner of the massive property he was trying to buy was suddenly standing right in the middle of the room, looking entirely capable and deeply, furiously angry. We stopped walking right in the exact center of the grand living room, exactly 10 feet away from the burning fireplace. 50 pairs of wealthy, prominent eyes darted frantically back and forth between my frozen, terrified parents and the imposing, unshakable figure of my grandfather. Nobody moved a single muscle. Nobody dared to take a breath. The festive, joyous New Year's Eve energy had been instantly, violently replaced by the terrifying, heavy atmosphere of an impending public execution. I stood tall beside my grandfather, my posture directly mirroring the rigid, unyielding strength of the man who had actually raised me. I could see the frantic, desperate calculations spinning rapidly behind my father's wide, panicked eyes as he finally realized his carefully orchestrated trap had completely, entirely failed. The beautiful colonial estate he thought he had successfully stolen was no longer his grand stage. It was his courtroom. And the trial he never saw coming was about to begin right in front of everyone he ever wanted to impress. The silence in the grand living room was so absolute, you could hear the soft crackle of the burning logs in the stone fireplace. 50 of the most influential people in the Boston suburbs stood perfectly still, holding their crystal glasses in midair. My father Richard recovered his senses with the desperate speed of a cornered animal. He plastered a wide, sickeningly sweet smile across his pale face and took 3 quick steps toward us. He held his hands out wide as if he were greeting a beloved relative returning from a long journey. "Claire, you brought Dad to the party," Richard announced. His voice was entirely too loud, trying to inject a tone of joyful surprise into the suffocating atmosphere. "How incredibly sweet of you to brave the snow, but he really needs to rest upstairs. His condition makes large crowds very overwhelming for him. Let me help him to his room." Richard reached out a trembling hand, aiming to grab my grandfather by the elbow. He was trying to quietly, physically force Walter out of the room before the illusion could completely shatter. But Walter simply raised his silver-tipped mahogany cane and planted it firmly on the hardwood floor, right between Richard's expensive leather shoes. "Do not touch me," Walter said. His voice was low, but it carried the absolute authority of a man who had spent 40 years commanding respect. "I am standing exactly where I intend to stand." Richard recoiled as if the cane had burned him. His fake smile twitched and contorted. Diane hurried up behind him, her face flushed a dark, angry red beneath her expensive makeup. She tried to grab my arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging painfully through the fabric of my coat. "Stop making a scene and get him out of here right now," Diane hissed directly into my ear, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. "You are ruining your sister's engagement." I looked down at my mother's grasping hand. I did not flinch. I did not shrink away. I calmly reached over and removed her fingers from my sleeve, dropping her hand as if it were something entirely repulsive. "I am not making a scene, Mom," I replied, keeping my volume perfectly level. "I am just bringing the guest of honor to his own house." I stepped around my completely paralyzed parents and walked purposefully toward the front of the room. A tall microphone stand had been set up right next to the massive fireplace intended for the joyous toasts my father had planned to deliver all night. The wealthy guests parted from me, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. I could hear the expensive fabric of their designer gowns rustling as they hastily moved out of my way. I stepped up to the microphone and adjusted the height with a sharp, deliberate click. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw Chad's parents standing near the front row, clutching their champagne flutes, their expressions shifting from polite confusion to growing alarm. I saw Brittany gripping Chad's arm, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unadulterated outrage. And I saw my father standing entirely defeated in the center of the aisle, staring at me with a look of pure, desperate terror. For 29 years, I had been the quiet daughter. I was the financial burden, the plain sister, the reliable background character, who cleaned up the messes and kept her mouth shut. I had swallowed my pride and accepted their disrespect because I thought that was what family required. But standing at that microphone, feeling the heavy weight of the manila folder in my hands, I finally felt the heavy chains of my childhood snap completely in half. I tapped the microphone twice. The dull thud echoed loudly across the high ceilings, ensuring I had every single person's undivided attention. "Good evening, everyone," I began. My voice was steady, clear, and completely devoid of any hesitation. "My name is Claire. I am Richard's daughter and Walter's granddaughter. I am also a professional financial controller. My father invited you all here tonight to celebrate a beautiful new union and the successful sale of this magnificent historic estate. But before anyone signs a single contract or transfers a single dollar, I think it is only fair that you understand exactly what you are buying." I opened the manila folder and pulled out the thick stack of bank statements and property records. The bright overhead lights illuminated the crisp black ink of my forensic audit. For the past year, my father has been telling his friends, his business partners, and his future in-laws that my grandfather is suffering from severe dementia, I said, projecting my words into the silent room. He claimed Walter was entirely incapable of managing his own affairs. He used this fabricated medical narrative to isolate a perfectly healthy 82-year-old man. He did this so nobody would question why Richard suddenly needed absolute control over the family finances. I held up the first document. It was the heavily documented withdrawal history from Walter's retirement accounts. 3 months ago, Richard illegally accessed Walter's secure pension and mutual fund accounts. I continued reading directly from the highlighted lines of my spreadsheet. He systematically drained $150,000 of his own father's life savings. That money did not go to medical care. It did not go to nursing facilities. It was wired directly into the operating account of a failing tech startup in Silicon Valley. I paused and looked directly at Chad. The arrogant young lawyer went incredibly pale, his smug demeanor instantly evaporating into thin air. "A startup completely owned and operated by my sister's brilliant fiancé," I added. The collective gasp that swept through the 50 wealthy guests was audible. Chad's father turned slowly to look at his son, his eyes narrowing with sudden furious suspicion. Chad tried to open his mouth to defend himself, but the shock had completely paralyzed his vocal cords. "But that was just the beginning of the theft," I said, dropping the first document and picking up the forged legal deed. $150,000 was not nearly enough to fund the luxurious high society lifestyle my parents wanted to project. They needed massive capital to throw the perfect wedding and buy the perfect luxury cars. So on October 12th, while my grandfather was heavily sedated in a hospital bed for a minor fall, my father executed a quitclaim deed. I held the document high in the air so everyone in the room could see the official county clerk stamp glowing in the warm ambient light. "This deed completely stripped Walter of the title to the home we are all standing in right now," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute chilling certainty. Richard transferred the ownership of this $1.2 million estate into a newly formed limited liability company called RM Holdings. He then used this stolen property as collateral to take out a massive predatory hard money loan for $800,000. He blew through that entire massive fortune in less than 60 days. I looked down at my father. He was visibly trembling, his hands shaking violently at his sides. The rich, influential friends he had spent years trying to cultivate were now staring at him like he was a dangerous infectious disease. "That loan defaults on January 2nd, I said, laying the brutal financial reality out for the entire room to witness. "If the massive balloon payment is not paid in full by next week, The predatory lender will foreclose on this property and seize the estate. That is exactly why my father is hosting this beautiful party tonight. He is entirely broke. His credit cards are currently frozen. He is suffocating in debt, and he desperately needs to sell this house tonight to pay off the corrupt lender before the entire illusion collapses. I turned my gaze away from my terrified father and locked eyes directly with Chad's parents. They were the cash buyers. They were the incredibly wealthy real estate investors who thought they were simply purchasing a gorgeous family home at a private off-market discount. The mother was clutching her pearl necklace, her face pale with shock. The father looked absolutely livid, his jaw set in a hard, furious line. "Mr. and Mrs. Hastings," I said, addressing them directly, "my father brought you here tonight to sign the final purchase agreements. He planned to use a fraudulent power of attorney to sign the closing documents on my grandfather's behalf. But I need you to know exactly what you are walking into. Yesterday afternoon, my grandfather's legal counsel officially filed a lis pendens on this property with the county clerk." I pulled the formal stamped legal notice from my folder and held it up. I made sure to enunciate every single syllable, so the severe legal implications would land heavily on their experienced real estate minds. "This house is currently the subject of an active, massive legal dispute," I announced. "The original deed transfer was a blatant criminal forgery. If you hand my father a cashier's check tonight, you are not buying a beautiful piece of real estate. You are buying stolen property that is entirely wrapped up in a massive federal fraud investigation. You will be handing your money directly to a man who is currently under investigation for felony elder financial abuse and multiple counts of federal wire fraud." The room erupted. It was not a loud, chaotic explosion, but a sudden intense wave of furious, urgent whispers. The wealthy guests were immediately backing away from Richard and Diane, treating them like absolute pariahs. Chad's father slammed his champagne glass down onto a nearby side table with enough force to nearly shatter the crystal. He glared at Richard with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The high society illusion was entirely, completely dead. Diane let out a loud, dramatic sob, covering her face with her diamond-ringed hands. She tried to lean against my father for support, but Richard was completely unresponsive, entirely consumed by the terrifying reality of his public destruction. Then the piercing sound of a woman's furious scream tore through the room. "She is lying!" Brittany shrieked violently, pushing her way past a group of startled guests. She stomped toward the front of the room, her face contorted into an ugly red mask of pure rage. Her expensive silk dress flared wildly around her legs as she pointed a shaking manicured finger right at my face. "Do not listen to a single word she is saying. She has always been a bitter, jealous loser. She is just a pathetic poor accountant who lives in a disgusting little apartment. She is making all of this up because she is furiously jealous of my wedding and my success. She wants to ruin my life because she has absolutely nothing of her own." Brittany was panting heavily, her eyes wild and frantic. She looked toward Chad's parents, desperately pleading with them to believe her entirely fabricated narrative. "Please, you have to believe us. My grandfather is sick. Claire is just exploiting his dementia to steal the spotlight. She is a completely crazy, jealous liar." Before I could even formulate a response to her unhinged, hysterical outburst, Chad suddenly snapped. The quiet, arrogant corporate lawyer, who had tried to bully me on my front porch just 2 days ago, completely lost his sophisticated composure. The realization that his failing startup had been publicly exposed as a massive financial black hole and that his wealthy parents were about to cut him off entirely sent him into a blind, absolute panic. "Shut your mouth right now!" Chad roared, his face turning a dark, violent shade of purple. He shoved past his own horrified mother and charged directly toward the microphone. He moved with an aggressive, threatening momentum, closing the distance between us in 3 long, rapid strides. He stopped just inches away from the podium, invading my personal space and looming over me with his fists tightly clenched at his sides. He thought he could intimidate me into silence using the sheer force of his physical presence and his empty legal threats. "You have absolutely no idea who you are messing with, you stupid little bookkeeper," Chad hissed, a fine spray of spit flying from his lips. I am going to destroy you for this. I will file a massive civil lawsuit for defamation and slander before the sun even comes up tomorrow. I will bury you in so much litigation, you will never see the light of day. I will personally sue you into total absolute bankruptcy, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life paying for what you just did to my reputation. I did not back away. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, gripping the edges of the wooden podium, looking straight into the terrified, furious eyes of a man who knew his entire privileged existence was actively burning to ashes. You cannot sue someone for defamation when they are telling the absolute verifiable truth, Chad, I replied, my voice completely calm and unshaken. And you are going to need a lot more than empty threats to get out of the federal crimes you just walked right into. The air in the grand living room was so thick with suffocating tension, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Chad was practically foaming at the mouth, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated panic and desperate corporate rage. He closed the remaining distance between us, raising his hands as if he was actually going to physically strike me right there in front of 50 wealthy guests. He thought he could use aggressive physical intimidation to silence the ugly truth. He genuinely believed that a simple freelance bookkeeper from a cramped suburban apartment would simply cower and retreat under the weight of his absolute arrogance. But I did not move a single inch. Walter stepped forward slightly, raising his silver-tipped mahogany cane just enough to signal that he would gladly strike the arrogant lawyer if he took one more aggressive step toward me. The 50 elite guests gasped out loud, holding their collective breath, as the beautiful high society illusion rapidly devolved into a messy public confrontation. Before Chad could unleash whatever violent legal threat was forming in his throat, a heavy, massive sound echoed through the grand foyer. The solid oak front doors of the estate were thrown open with such violent, tremendous force that they slammed loudly against the interior plaster walls. A sudden rushing wave of freezing December wind swept into the warm, luxurious living room, carrying a flurry of white winter snow and completely cutting off the arrogant lawyer. Every single head in the room instantly turned toward the grand entrance. Standing perfectly framed in the wide archway was attorney Thomas Gallagher. The formidable estate lawyer was not alone tonight. He was flanked closely by two broad-shouldered uniformed police officers and a stern plainclothes detective wearing a heavy dark trench coat and an expression of absolute rigid authority. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses and swept his piercing gray eyes across the silent, frozen crowd. He did not look at my terrified parents. He looked directly at me and gave a single slow, deliberate nod of confirmation. The trap had not just been sprung. It was now fully and legally enforced. The plainclothes detective stepped forward, pulling a leather badge wallet from his heavy coat pocket and holding it up high for the entire shocked room to see. The polished silver badge caught the sparkling light of the expensive crystal chandeliers. The sudden jarring appearance of official law enforcement right in the middle of a prestigious holiday celebration sent a massive shockwave of absolute terror through the wealthy attendees. People began frantically whispering, shifting their expensive shoes, and desperately trying to distance themselves from the center of the room where my father stood. Richard frantically scrambled to recover his completely shattered dignity. He smoothed the dark lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo and forced a terrible hollow laugh that sounded like dry autumn leaves scraping across rough pavement. He took 2 hesitant steps toward the detective, holding his hands out in a sweeping gesture of false friendly camaraderie. Officers, there must be some sort of ridiculous bureaucratic misunderstanding, my father said, his voice vibrating with desperate, frantic charm. We are simply hosting a private holiday gathering for our lovely family and our very close business partners. My estranged daughter here has caused a minor unfortunate domestic disturbance, but we were just about to graciously escort her out of the door. There is absolutely no need for police intervention tonight, gentlemen. I assure you, I have this situation entirely under control. The detective did not smile. He did not return the friendly, welcoming gesture. He simply looked down at a folded legal document resting in his hand, and then looked my father dead in the eye. Richard Myers, the detective, asked, his voice booming with undeniable, crushing authority. My father swallowed hard, the remaining color draining completely from his face once again. "Yes, that is me," my father stammered. The detective took a firm step forward, signaling the two uniformed police officers to move in closely. "Richard Myers, I have a warrant for your immediate arrest," the detective announced loudly, ensuring every single elite guest heard the devastating charges clearly. "You are being charged with multiple severe counts of felony elder financial abuse, aggravated identity theft, and federal wire fraud connected to the fraudulent corporate entity we discussed." A collective horrified gasp ripped violently through the crowded living room. Diane let out a piercing, completely unhinged scream, grabbing tightly onto the cold stone mantel of the fireplace to keep her trembling legs from giving out entirely. The two uniformed officers stepped right up to my father, grabbing his arms and spinning him around forcefully. Richard tried to resist, pulling his shoulder away in blind, absolute panic. "I did not do anything," he shouted, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "I am the designated medical caretaker. He is sick. He has advanced dementia. You cannot do this to me." But the officers did not care about the desperate, pathetic lies. One of them kicked the feet of my father apart, while the other pulled his wrists firmly behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping closed echoed through the silent room with absolute beautiful finality. It was the most glorious, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Chad stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish out of water. He stared at the cold steel cuffs, gleaming against the expensive tuxedo of his future father-in-law. And then the final devastating blow to the grand illusion of my family arrived. The father of Chad, a man who had built his immense fortune on shrewd, careful legal real estate investments, pushed his way violently through the silent crowd. He marched directly up to Chad, his face a dark shade of crimson with pure, unadulterated fury. He did not care about social etiquette or polite, wealthy appearances anymore. "You absolute idiot!" the father of Chad roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. "You brought us here tonight to buy a stolen house. You tried to entangle our legitimate family business in a federal money laundering scheme. I trusted you to properly vet this real estate property, and instead, you almost made us an accessory to felony wire fraud." Chad stumbled backward, putting his hands up defensively. "Dad, I swear I did not know," Chad pleaded, his voice completely stripped of its usual arrogant corporate confidence. "He lied to me. He said he had the legal power of attorney. I did not know the deed was a forgery. I swear to you, I am a victim here too." His father let out a harsh, bitter laugh of absolute disgust. "You are a complete gullible fool," he spat venomously. "And you are officially completely cut off from our family accounts." The mother of Chad stepped forward, grabbing her adult son by the arm with fingers like steel talons. "We are leaving right now," she commanded, pulling him forcefully toward the grand foyer. "The wedding is completely canceled immediately. We will not have our pristine family name associated with these cheap, desperate criminals. Do not ever speak to this girl again." She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at Brittany, who was standing completely paralyzed in her custom silk dress. "No," Brittany shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical, sobbing wail. "Chad, please wait. You cannot just leave me here. We are supposed to get married. We are supposed to go to Aspen next month." Chad did not even look back at her. He kept his head down, letting his furious, wealthy parents drag him away from the burning wreckage of his social standing. They grabbed their expensive cashmere coats from the terrified valet and marched out the front doors without a single backward glance. Brittany collapsed onto a plush velvet sofa, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, mourning the absolute loss of her wealthy future and her perfect fake life. The detective cleared his throat, pulling the attention of the room back to the center aisle. He began reading the Miranda rights to my father in a loud, clear, steady voice. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Richard looked utterly, completely destroyed. He was no longer the imposing, terrifying patriarch who had dictated my entire miserable existence. He was just a pathetic, cowardly thief, caught red-handed in his own home. He looked up at Walter, his eyes welling with desperate, pathetic tears. "Dad, please." Richard begged, his voice a hollow, pitiful whisper. "Please do not let them do this to me. Tell them it is a terrible mistake. I am your son." Walter leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane, looking down at the broken man who had tried to steal his home, his life savings, and his human dignity. "You are not my son," Walter said, his voice calm, steady, and completely devoid of any remaining sympathy. "My son would never steal from a trusting old man. My son would never try to lock me away in a dark facility just to steal my money. You made your choices, Richard. Now you will face the absolute consequences of your greed. Take him away, officers." The uniformed police officers grabbed Richard firmly by the arms and began marching him down the center aisle. It was the ultimate devastating walk of absolute shame. The 50 wealthy elite guests, the specific people Richard had stolen a massive fortune just to impress, watched him with expressions of total disgust and severe public judgment. They pulled out their expensive smartphones, snapping quick pictures and recording digital videos of the prominent local businessman being led out in cold steel handcuffs. Richard kept his head bowed, staring deeply at the hardwood floor, unable to meet the harsh, judging eyes of the people he had tried so desperately to deceive. As the heavy oak doors finally closed behind the police officers taking my father away to a federal holding cell, my mother finally broke completely. Diane dropped heavily to the floor, her knees hitting the polished wood with a hard thud. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, rocking back and forth, crying massive, heaving, ugly sobs. Her expensive diamond jewelry sparkled mockingly against her tear-stained designer dress. She looked up at me, her thick dark makeup running down her face in messy, wet streaks. "Claire, how could you do this to us?" she wailed, her voice thick with hysterical, terrifying grief. "We are your family. We are your blood. You ruined absolutely everything tonight." I looked down at the pathetic woman who had stood by silently for years while my father constantly called me worthless. I looked at the exact woman who had threatened to blame me for a hypothetical tragedy just 3 days ago. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt zero sorrow. I felt only a profound, sweeping sense of immense, clean, beautiful peace. "I am not the one who ruined everything, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and completely emotionally detached. "You and Dad built your entire luxurious lives on greedy lies and stolen money. I simply turned on the lights and let everyone finally see the ugly truth. You made your own miserable choices. I am just the quiet bookkeeper who finally checked the math." The remaining elite guests did not stick around to enjoy another drink. They scrambled frantically toward the front coat room, desperate to completely escape the radioactive financial scandal. Within 15 short minutes, the Grand Colonial Estate was completely entirely empty, except for the 3 of us and a highly confused, nervous catering staff. The beautiful silence finally returned to the massive living room, but it was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was light. It was incredibly breathable. It was completely, wonderfully free. I turned to look at my grandfather. He was standing incredibly tall, leaning gently on his polished cane, watching the final glowing taillights of the departing luxury cars disappear slowly down the snowy winter street. He reached out his arm and placed his strong, warm hand heavily on my shoulder, giving it a firm, incredibly proud squeeze. "We did it," Claire Walter said, a gentle, beautiful, genuine smile spreading across his weathered face. "We finally got our home back from the monsters." I smiled back at him, feeling a single warm tear of pure, overwhelming relief slide slowly down my cheek. "Yes, Grandpa," I replied, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. "We finally did it." If you are watching this story and you have ever been treated like a terrible burden by the exact people who were supposed to unconditionally love you, I want you to listen to me very carefully right now. Setting hard boundaries with toxic family members is never an act of cruel revenge. It is an act of pure, necessary survival. You do not owe your absolute loyalty to people who constantly drain your energy, steal your joy, and use your quiet nature against you. You have every single right in the world to stand up, speak your truth, and demand the respect you truly deserve. You are not a bad person for exposing the toxic lies they desperately try to keep hidden in the dark. Thank you so incredibly much for staying with me through this long emotional journey until the very end. If my personal story resonated with you in any way, please take a quick moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Your support really helps these important stories reach the exact people who desperately need to hear them today. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this situation. Have you ever had to expose a toxic family member to protect yourself or someone you deeply love? Drop a comment below right now and let me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is in your city. I read every single comment you leave. Until next time, please remember to always protect your peace and never let anyone make you feel small. Take care of yourself. You completely deserve it. The heavy snows that buried Boston during that chaotic winter slowly melted away, giving way to a bright, crisp spring. 4 months had passed since the explosive confrontation at my grandfather's estate, and the absolute silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The massive tangled web of financial fraud my father had so arrogantly woven had not just unraveled, it had completely violently snapped. I spent the first few weeks of the new year working closely with Thomas Gallagher and the federal prosecutors, carefully walking them through the meticulous forensic audit I had compiled. My father and defense attorneys initially tried to posture and threaten, but the moment they saw the digital paper trail, the wire transfers, the forged signature, and the unauthorized liquidations from Walter, a retirement accounts, their aggressive tactics instantly evaporated. Richard did not even make it to a trial. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the terrifying prospect of spending the rest of his natural life behind bars, he took a desperate plea deal. I sat in the back row of a sterile federal courtroom on a rainy Tuesday morning and watched the man who had terrorized me for 29 years stand before a judge. He was no longer wearing his custom-tailored Italian suits. He looked small, incredibly frail, and utterly defeated in his standard-issue prison uniform. He was sentenced to 84 months in a federal penitentiary, followed by 5 years of supervised release. More importantly, the judge ordered massive financial restitution. Every single cent Richard had stolen to fund his fake high society lifestyle had to be repaid to the estate. His personal assets were seized. His bank accounts were drained. The grand illusion of Richard Myers was officially dead and buried. With my father sitting in a federal holding cell, the brutal reality of the situation crashed down heavily on the 2 women who had happily floated on his stolen wealth. Thomas Gallagher and I did not waste a single moment reclaiming Walter a property. As the legally appointed trustee of my grandfather, a new irrevocable trust, I formally served my mother Diane with a 30-day notice of eviction. She tried to fight it, of course. She tried to call her wealthy country club friends begging for loans and legal favors, but the toxic fallout from the New Year Eve scandal had rendered her completely radioactive. Nobody in her elite social circle wanted anything to do with the wife of a convicted federal fraudster. Diane was forcefully, unceremoniously evicted from the sprawling colonial estate she had treated as her personal kingdom. She was forced to pack her expensive designer clothes and her sparkling diamond jewelry into cheap cardboard boxes and move into a new reality. Because her credit was entirely destroyed by the legal seizures and because she had absolutely zero employment history, she could only secure a lease in a rundown building on the industrial edge of the city. It was a tiny, cramped third-floor walk-up apartment with peeling linoleum floors, dripping faucets, and paper-thin walls that let in the constant aggressive noise of the highway traffic outside. It was a space exponentially worse than the modest apartment she used to mock me for living in. For years, my mother had turned her nose up at my simple home, telling me my environment was a direct reflection of my personal failures. Now she was trapped in a drafty, foul-smelling box, forced to carry her own groceries up 3 flights of concrete stairs, completely stripped of the maids, the valets, and the catering services she thought she fundamentally deserved. The poetic justice of her living situation was absolute. My sister Brittany suffered an equally spectacular fall from grace. The very night the police marched our father out of the house in steel handcuffs, Chad and his wealthy parents vanished completely into the winter darkness. They severed all contact with Brittany, immediately blocking her phone number and scrubbing her entirely from their pristine public image. The lavish high society wedding was abruptly, definitively canceled. But the financial wreckage of that canceled wedding remained entirely in Brittany a lap. During the peak of her arrogant planning, my sister had insisted on putting thousands of dollars of non-refundable deposits on her own premium credit cards, assuming my father would simply pay the massive balances off with his endless supply of cash. When Richard was arrested and his accounts were frozen, Brittany was left holding over $60,000 in high-interest consumer debt. She had no college degree, no practical skills, and absolutely zero work ethic. With collection agencies calling her phone relentlessly every single morning, the golden child of the Myers family was forced to do something she had actively despised her entire life. She had to get a job. Brittany was hired as a floor associate at a fast fashion retail store inside a loud, crowded shopping mall. The girl who had literally sipped expensive champagne and eaten imported caviar in Aspen was now spending 8 grueling hours a day standing on her feet under harsh fluorescent lights. She had to fold cheap synthetic sweaters, clean out messy fitting rooms, and force polite retail smiles for demanding customers who treated her with the exact same dismissive arrogance she used to inflict on everyone else. Her perfectly manicured hands were constantly bruised and broken from wrestling with plastic hangers and heavy shipment boxes. She was living the exact exhausting paycheck-to-paycheck reality she had mocked me for enduring during my college years. They were both drowning in the deep, turbulent waters of their own terrible choices. And yet, despite everything that had happened, they still believed they could manipulate their way out of the consequences. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening in late April. I was sitting at the sturdy wooden dining table inside Walter, a beautifully restored colonial estate, working peacefully on my bookkeeping ledgers. My grandfather was sitting comfortably in his favorite leather armchair, reading a historical biography, with a warm cup of tea resting on the side table beside him. The house was calm, safe, and entirely ours. My cell phone buzzed against the polished wood of the table. I glanced at the screen and saw an unknown local number flashing brightly. I hesitated for a brief second, my professional instincts warring with a sudden deep sense of caution. I answered the call, keeping my voice neutral and polite. "Claire." "My mother." A voice crackled through the small speaker. She sounded terrible. The smooth, confident, arrogant tone she had weaponized for decades was completely gone, replaced by a thin, ragged, raspy wheeze. I could hear the loud, obnoxious blare of a police siren passing by the window of her cheap apartment in the background. "Mom," I replied, my voice completely steady. "Claire, please do not hang up on me," Diane pleaded, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, desperate rush. "Please, I need you to listen to me. I am so incredibly sick. My back is constantly aching from sleeping on this terrible cheap mattress. The radiator in this awful building makes this horrible banging noise all night long, and I cannot sleep. The landlord is threatening to add late fees to my rent, and I have barely enough money to buy groceries this week. I am so miserable, Claire. I am so cold and so lonely." I leaned back in my wooden chair, looking across the warm, beautifully lit room at my grandfather. He glanced up from his book, his sharp brown eyes watching my face with quiet understanding. He knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I listened to my mother cry. I listened to her complain about the terrible conditions of her life, the noise, the lack of money, the physical exhaustion of simply trying to survive. I waited patiently for the apology. I waited for her to acknowledge the horrific emotional abuse she had inflicted on me. I waited for her to take a single ounce of responsibility for allowing my father to steal from an 82-year-old man. I waited for her to say she was sorry for throwing me away. But the apology never came. "Claire, I know you have control of the trust accounts now," my mother sobbed, pushing her desperation into a sharp, demanding whine. "You have all that money just sitting there. You are living in that massive house. You have to help me. I am your mother. You cannot just leave me here in this disgusting place to rot. Please, Claire, just wire me $5,000. just enough to get me caught up on my bills and buy a decent bed. It is just a small drop in the bucket for you now. You owe me that much family loyalty." I closed my eyes and took a deep, clean breath. I thought about the night I begged her to help me secure a simple loan for my college textbooks, and how she had looked at me with cold indifference and told me I was not worth the investment. I thought about the text message she had sent me threatening to blame me for Walter a death if I dared to expose my father a crimes. I thought about the 29 years I had spent shrinking myself down into a tiny invisible box just to survive her conditional love. The heavy lingering guilt that society conditions daughters to feel toward their mothers finally completely evaporated from my chest. There was nothing left but pure, absolute clarity. "Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chillingly calm register. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, because I am only going to say this once." The line went dead silent except for her ragged breathing. "You and Dad spent my entire life teaching me a very specific lesson about family." I continued articulating every single word with brutal precision. "When I needed help, you told me I was a burden. When I needed support, you told me I was a bad investment. When I needed a mother, you told me I was a jealous, bitter disappointment. You built your beautiful, wealthy life by actively destroying mine, and you never lost a single second of sleep over it." "But Claire," please, Diane whimpered, trying to interrupt the cold, hard truth. "No," I said, cutting her off with absolute authority. "You do not get to speak right now. You do not get to demand family loyalty from the daughter you actively threw away the moment she became inconvenient. You chose to live a lie. You chose to support a criminal. You chose a luxury car over your own father-in-law, a safety. And now you are sitting exactly where your choices put you." I looked down at the financial ledgers spread across my table. The numbers were perfectly balanced. The accounts were secure. The estate was completely protected. "I am not going to wire you any money, Mom," I said, delivering the final, irrevocable blow. "I am not going to pay your rent, and I am not going to save you from the miserable life you built for yourself. You told me for 29 years that the best way to handle a problem was to figure it out completely alone. So I am just doing you a simple favor by letting you figure it out yourself exactly like you did to me." "No, wait, Claire, please, you cannot just—" Diane screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical, terrified wail. I pulled the phone away from my ear, looking at the active call screen for one brief final moment. I pressed the red button, completely severing the connection. I immediately opened my contact settings, selected her number, and blocked it permanently. I did the exact same thing for Brittany, and I deleted every single digital connection I had left to my former life. I set the phone face down on the table and let out a long, slow breath. The silence in the grand colonial house was beautiful. Walter closed his book and looked at me, a gentle, proud smile touching his weathered face. "Is everything handled, Claire?" my grandfather asked, his voice warm and steady. "Yes, Grandpa," I replied, feeling a massive invisible weight lift completely off my shoulders. "Everything is perfectly handled. For 29 years I believed that family was defined entirely by blood and obligation. I believed that love was something I had to constantly painfully earn by making myself as small and useful as possible. I thought if I just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and fixed enough of their mistakes, they would finally look at me and see my value. But the brutal, beautiful truth I learned from surviving the absolute worst of their greed is that your true value has absolutely nothing to do with how the people who broke you perceive you. Setting ironclad boundaries with toxic family members is not an act of cruel revenge. It is an act of profound, necessary self-preservation. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire simply to keep your abusers warm. You have the absolute right to demand respect to protect your own peace, and to walk entirely away from any table where love is served as a conditional transaction. I built a beautiful, safe life completely from the ashes of their destruction, and I did it by finally choosing myself. Thank you so much for walking through this incredible journey with me until the very end. If my story struck a chord with you, if you have ever felt invisible in your own family, or had to make the difficult, necessary choice to walk away from toxic people, I want you to know that you are not alone. please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Your support pushes these stories out to the people who desperately need to hear them today. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on setting boundaries with family. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I read every single comment you leave. Until next time, remember to protect your peace fiercely and never apologize for knowing your own worth. Take care of yourself. The heavy, suffocating frost that had buried Boston during that chaotic winter slowly yielded to a brilliant and vivid spring. The thick sheets of gray ice that had once coated the tall, arched windows of my grandfather's colonial estate melted away, leaving behind perfectly clear glass that let the bright morning sunlight pour freely into every single room. I stood on the sprawling, wraparound porch, holding a warm mug of dark roast coffee, simply listening to the quiet, peaceful symphony of the awakening neighborhood. For the first time in my entire 29 years of existence, my chest did not feel incredibly tight with the familiar heavy dread of impending family drama. I took a deep, clean breath of the crisp morning air and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute safety. Down in the sprawling's backyard, Walter was already awake and moving with extraordinary purpose. He was wearing thick canvas gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed hat, kneeling beside the massive rose bushes my grandmother had planted over 4 decades ago. He was carefully, meticulously pruning away the dead, decaying branches from the harsh winter to make room for fresh, vibrant green growth. I watched him work his silver cane resting casually against a nearby wooden bench, completely unnecessary in this moment of pure vitality. My father had spent an entire year desperately trying to convince the world that this strong, capable man was a declining, confused burden. Watching Walter confidently dig his hands into the rich, dark soil restoring life to his beloved garden, I realized how spectacularly my father had failed. We had successfully weeded out the toxic, decaying roots of our own family tree, and now we were finally allowing ourselves to properly bloom. Our daily routine inside the sprawling estate had become a beautiful, predictable sanctuary. We shared breakfast every morning at the large mahogany dining table, discussing the morning news and planning our respective days. The massive house, which had felt so incredibly intimidating and empty when my father was parading his wealthy elite friends through its hallways, now felt remarkably warm and lived in. The suffocating silence of walking on eggshells completely vanished. I was no longer the anxious, overlooked daughter desperately trying to shrink myself down to avoid criticism. I was simply Claire, and for the very first time I felt entirely unconditionally valued just for breathing. On a remarkably bright Tuesday morning in early May, Walter asked me to drive him back downtown to the prestigious law office of Thomas Gallagher. We navigated the bustling city streets, with the windows rolled down the warm spring breeze, filling the cabin of my beat-up but reliable 10-year-old sedan. When we arrived, Thomas was waiting for us in his private polished study, a warm, genuine smile lighting up his stern features. He ushered us toward the heavy leather chairs positioned in front of his massive desk. Resting perfectly centered on the dark wood was a thick stack of freshly printed legal parchment. Walter sat down and folded his hands over the top of his silver-tipped cane, looking directly at the formidable estate attorney. Thomas nodded respectfully and slid the thick document across the desk toward my grandfather. I sat quietly, assuming this was simply another routine piece of paperwork required to permanently finalize the dissolution of my father's fraudulent shell corporation. But as Thomas began to formally summarize the contents of the document, my heart completely stopped. It was not a corporate dissolution form. It was a brand new, entirely rewritten last will and testament. Thomas explained the precise legal language with his usual commanding authority. Walter had officially, permanently, legally disinherited Richard. But the most staggering revelation came in the following clause. Walter was legally naming me as the sole heir to his entire estate. Every single asset, the historic colonial house, the extensive investment portfolios, the restored mutual funds, and every piece of sentimental property was being irrevocably left entirely to me. I felt the warm air suddenly leave my lungs. I looked over at my grandfather, my vision instantly blurring with thick, overwhelming tears. "Grandpa?" I whispered, my voice trembling with the sheer magnitude of what he was doing. "You do not have to do this. I did not help you just to get your money. I just wanted you to be safe." Walter reached across the polished mahogany desk and placed his strong, weathered hand firmly over mine. His sharp brown eyes were shining with a profound, fierce, absolute love that completely shattered the lingering, painful echoes of my childhood. "I know exactly why you did it, Claire," Walter said, his deep, resonant voice filling the quiet study. "You saved my life when the people who were supposed to protect me tried to bury me alive. Your father looked at your brilliant, meticulous mind and told you that you were not worth an investment. He was a blind, arrogant fool. You are the absolute best investment this family has ever produced. You are my legacy now. I am leaving this estate to you because I know with absolute certainty that you will protect it, value it, and use it to build something incredibly beautiful." The tears spilled completely over my eyelashes, sliding down my cheeks as I sat in that quiet professional room. I remembered the years of crushing high-interest student debt. I remembered working 3 exhausting jobs just to afford basic textbooks while my parents bought my sister luxury cars and designer clothes. I remembered feeling so completely, entirely worthless. And now the man who had built this entire family empire was looking me dead in the eye and handing me the keys to his kingdom. He was formally, legally binding my worth into the official public record. When we returned to the estate that afternoon, Walter and I sat on the back patio drinking iced tea and watching the sun begin to set over the manicured hedges. He looked at me and asked a simple, profound question. "What do you actually want to do with the rest of your life, Claire?" I thought about the grueling 10-hour forensic audit I had performed on Christmas morning in my freezing, cramped apartment. I thought about the absolute thrill of hunting down the hidden wire transfers, the adrenaline of exposing the fraudulent shell company, and the immense, beautiful satisfaction of using my financial knowledge to completely dismantle a predator. "I want to stop people like my father," I answered honestly, the realization blooming fiercely in my chest. "I want to use my bookkeeping skills to track down financial abuse. I want to protect elderly people who cannot protect themselves." Walter smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Then let us build a business," he said. With Walter's enthusiastic financial backing and absolute unwavering support, I officially resigned from my exhausting, stressful string of freelance bookkeeping contracts. I took a massive, terrifying leap of faith and opened my very own independent accounting firm. I leased a beautiful, bright office space just a few miles from the estate. I ordered professional frosted glass doors that proudly displayed my name and the specific mission of my firm. I specialized exclusively in forensic accounting and elder financial protection. The transition from a quiet, overlooked sister to a formidable business owner was incredibly empowering. I worked closely with local estate attorneys, including Thomas Gallagher, to review complex trust documents and monitor the financial accounts of vulnerable senior citizens. I built a formidable reputation in the greater Boston area as a relentless, meticulous auditor who could track a single missing dollar through a maze of offshore accounts. Within the very first 6 months of operation, my firm helped expose 3 different cases of severe elder exploitation. In one specific instance, I worked alongside the exact same plainclothes detective who had arrested my father to completely dismantle a corrupt nursing home administrator who was secretly draining the bank accounts of isolated patients. Standing in the police precinct, watching another greedy predator face the absolute consequences of their actions, I felt a deep, resounding sense of purpose. I was actively turning the darkest, most traumatic chapter of my entire life into a powerful shielding weapon for the innocent. As my professional life flourished, my personal life began to blossom in ways I had never allowed myself to imagine. In late August, Walter and I decided to host a large summer barbecue at the Colonial Estate. We strung warm golden lights across the wide branches of the ancient oak trees and hired a fantastic local catering company to manage the food, so we could simply relax and enjoy the evening. As I stood on the wooden deck, looking out over the sprawling green lawn, I realized just how incredibly different this gathering was from the toxic high society events my parents used to force upon this property. There were no fake, polite smiles. There was no desperate social climbing. There was no walking on eggshells or quietly hiding in the kitchen to avoid my mother's harsh, judgmental whispers. The yard was filled with the sounds of genuine boisterous laughter. Thomas Gallagher was sitting at a patio table, telling a fantastic dramatic story to a group of my new professional colleagues. The detective who had handled my father's case stopped by with his wonderful wife, sharing a plate of grilled vegetables and laughing warmly with Walter. Several of the elderly clients I had successfully protected through my firm were sitting comfortably in the shade, completely relaxed and entirely safe. I was completely surrounded by a vibrant, wonderful community of people who respected my mind, valued my absolute integrity, and cared for me without any hidden manipulative conditions. I had actively built a genuine family of choice. Later that evening, long after the final guests had hugged us goodbye, and the caterers had packed away their equipment, Walter and I sat alone by the grand stone fireplace in the living room. The warm summer breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the sweet, familiar scent of blooming jasmine from the garden. The house was so incredibly peaceful. I leaned back into the soft cushions of the velvet sofa and looked at my grandfather, feeling a wave of absolute contentment settle deep into my bones. We had survived the absolute worst kind of betrayal. We had faced the terrifying, greedy monster that lived inside our own family, and we had won. My father was sitting in a federal prison cell, completely stripped of his arrogant illusions. My mother was trapped in a miserable, cramped apartment, entirely isolated by her own toxic pride. And my sister was folding clothes in a crowded shopping mall, drowning in the exact financial debt she had carelessly built. They were all living in the very prisons they had constructed for themselves. I realized in that quiet, beautiful moment that the hardest lesson I ever had to learn was also the most liberating truth in the world. For 29 years, I had desperately believed that unconditional loyalty was the absolute baseline requirement of family. I thought that if I sacrificed enough of my own happiness, if I stayed quiet and absorbed their cruelty, they would eventually magically realize my worth. I thought suffering in silence was a noble requirement of love. But I was wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. Blind sacrifice for people who do not value you is not love. It is absolute self-destruction. When you constantly pour your energy, your resources, and your spirit into an endless black hole of family entitlement, you are not keeping the peace. You are simply funding your own psychological demise. You cannot heal a toxic dynamic by making yourself smaller. You cannot buy genuine respect from people who fundamentally benefit from your submission. Setting ironclad boundaries with the people who share your blood is the most terrifying, incredibly difficult thing you will ever do. It requires you to stand completely alone in the storm and face the brutal reality of who your family truly is. But setting boundaries is not a brick wall to isolate yourself from the world. It is a necessary, beautiful door to protect your peace. It is the bold, courageous act of finally looking in the mirror and deciding that you are entirely worth saving. I lost the toxic family I was born into, but I gained my entire absolute life. Have you ever had to stand up against your own blood to protect what was right? Have you ever had to draw a hard, permanent line in the sand and walk away from the people who were supposed to love you the most? Where are you watching this video from right now, and exactly what time is it there? Drop a comment below right now and share your story. I read every single one. If this journey of exposing the truth and taking back control resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story about reclaiming your power. Until next time, remember that no matter how dark the chapter gets, you always have the pen. You write your own ending. Take care of yourself. You completely deserve it.